Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through time, back to an era when a woman's exhaustion was not just misunderstood, it was blamed on her body betraying her from within. Picture this: ancient Athens, 400 years before Christ, where brilliant male philosophers debated the cosmos, while women whispered to each other about a terrifying diagnosis. Your womb, they said, could wander. It could drift through your body like a restless spirit, searching for moisture, causing madness, paralysis, and an exhaustion so deep that some women could barely rise from their beds. And the strangest part? This was not folklore. This was medicine. This was what the greatest minds of the ancient world actually believed. Now, before we step into this ancient world together, I want to ask you something. If this story intrigues you, if you are curious about how women survived, how they fought, how they healed when the world misunderstood them so completely, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? Hit that like button, not because I am asking, but because something here resonates with you. And I would love to know, where are you right now? Are you in bed, beneath soft blankets? Are you listening while the world sleeps around you? Drop a comment and tell me where this story finds you tonight. Now, let us dim the lights, let the world grow quiet, and step back more than 2,000 years into the past. Imagine you are a woman in ancient Greece. The sun rises over the Aegean, and you wake feeling heavy, drained, as though you have been carrying stones all night. Your limbs ache, your mind feels clouded. You try to describe this to your husband, but he does not understand. He tells you to see the physician, so you go. The physician is a man, of course. Women are not allowed to study medicine. He examines you, not with tools, not with tests, but with questions and theories passed down through generations. And then he tells you something that would sound absurd to us today, but was terrifying then. Your womb has wandered. It has left its place and is floating through your body, searching for moisture. This is why you feel faint. This is why you are exhausted. This is why your breath feels short and your heart races. This was not the ramblings of one confused doctor. This was the foundation of ancient Greek medicine, taught by none other than Hippocrates himself, the father of medicine, the man whose oath doctors still swear today. He coined a term for this condition, hysteria, and that word comes from the Greek word hystera, which means womb. Think about that for a moment. For thousands of years, female exhaustion, anxiety, sadness, and fatigue were all blamed on one organ, an organ that men believed could move. How did they treat it? This is where the story gets truly strange. Physicians prescribe fumigation. They would burn strong-smelling herbs beneath a woman and waft the smoke upward, believing the scent would lure the wayward womb back into place. They also prescribed fragrant oils applied to the lower body. And in some cases, brace yourself for this one, they prescribed marriage and intercourse, believing that a pregnancy would anchor the womb and cure the hysteria. But here is the heartbreaking truth. Many of these women were simply exhausted. They were tired from carrying water, grinding grain, weaving cloth, bearing children, and managing households, all while being told their fatigue was their body's failure, not society's demands. Now, let me tell you about a woman who changed everything. Her name was Agnodis, and her story is one of courage that still echoes through history. This was Athens in the 4th century before Christ, and women were forbidden by law to practice medicine. But Agnodis was determined. She disguised herself as a man. She cut her hair, wore men's robes, and studied medicine under the famous physician Herophilus in Alexandria. When she returned to Athens, she began treating women, still disguised, and word spread quickly. Women who had refused male physicians, women who felt ashamed or afraid, began seeking her out. She helped them through difficult births, she eased their pain. She listened to them describe their exhaustion and actually believed them, rather than blaming a wandering womb, but success drew suspicion. Male physicians, jealous of her popularity, accused her of seducing female patients. The charge was serious. When Agnodis was dragged before the court, she did something extraordinary. She revealed the truth. She pulled back her robes and showed that she was a woman. The judges were outraged, not at her accusers, but at her. She had broken the law by practicing medicine as a woman. She faced execution. But then something remarkable happened. The women of Athens revolted. They marched to the court. They surrounded the judges and declared, "If you kill her, you kill the one who saved us. If you call her a criminal, then we would rather die with her than be treated by men who do not understand us." The judges backed down, Agnodis was acquitted, and even more astonishing, the law was changed. For the first time in Athenian history, women were allowed to practice medicine, specifically to treat other women. Think about what this means. Women in ancient Greece knew, even 2400 years ago, that their exhaustion was not madness. They knew their bodies better than any theory. They needed healers who would listen, not dismiss. Yet even after Agnodis's victory, the theory of the wandering womb persisted. It would dominate medical thinking for another 1,000 years, well into the Middle Ages. Galen, the Roman physician whose texts became medical law for over a millennium, reinforced this idea. He believed the womb could dry out and cause illness, and he prescribed similarly strange remedies, strong wines, pungent herbs, and yes, marital relations. But here is what fascinates me most. Beneath all these bizarre theories, there was a kernel of truth that ancient medicine stumbled upon accidentally. Many women suffering from hysteria were genuinely exhausted, and some of the remedies, though prescribed for completely wrong reasons, actually helped. Take valerian root, for example. Greek physicians prescribed it for hysteria, believing it would calm the restless womb. We know now that valerian has no effect on the uterus, but it does have mild sedative properties. It helps with sleep. And exhausted women who could finally rest did feel better, not because their wombs stopped wandering, but because they got the sleep their bodies desperately needed. Or consider the emphasis on moisture. Ancient physicians believed dryness caused the womb to wander, so they prescribed hydration, moist foods, and baths. Were they right about the wandering womb? Absolutely not. But were they right that exhausted, stressed women benefit from rest, hydration, and warm baths? Absolutely yes. This is the paradox of ancient medicine. The theories were wildly wrong, but sometimes by accident the treatments helped anyway. Now let us compare this to another ancient medical tradition that flourished at the same time, thousands of miles away. In China, traditional medicine also sought to explain female fatigue, but through an entirely different lens. Instead of a wandering womb, Chinese physicians spoke of imbalanced qi, of yin and yang out of harmony. They believed exhaustion came from blockages in energy flow, not from organs drifting through the body, and their treatments. Acupuncture to restore flow, herbal tonics like ginseng to rebuild energy, dietary balance to strengthen the body. Interestingly, modern research has found that some of these approaches do have measurable effects on fatigue, particularly adaptogenic herbs that help the body manage stress. The Greeks and the Chinese were asking the same question, why are women so exhausted? But they arrived at completely different answers. One blamed anatomy, the other blamed energy. Both were groping in the dark, trying to understand something they could not see. The crushing weight of being a woman in a world designed by and for men. But here is what I find most powerful about this ancient period. Despite the absurd theories, despite the dangerous treatments, women found ways to survive. They whispered remedies to each other. They sought out healers like Agnodis who actually listened. They learned which herbs truly helped them sleep, which foods gave them energy, which rituals brought comfort. Because when medicine fails you, you learn to heal yourself. When the experts do not believe you, you trust your own body. And when the world tells you that your exhaustion is your fault, you find other women who understand and you survive together. This was just the beginning. The wandering womb theory would persist for over 1,000 years, but women would not wait for medicine to catch up. They would become their own healers, their own experts, their own wise women. And that story of how women created their own medical knowledge in the shadows is where we are headed next. But first, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt exhausted and been told it was all in your head? Have you ever known something was wrong with your body, but doctors could not find it, or worse, did not believe you? If so, you are connected to every woman in history who fought to be heard, to be believed, to be healed. In our next part, we will meet the wise women of medieval Europe, the herbalists, the healers, the ones who kept ancient knowledge alive when the world tried to silence them. We will discover which of their remedies actually worked, which are still used today, and why so many of these women were eventually accused of witchcraft for the crime of knowing too much. The journey through women's fight against fatigue has only just begun, and I promise you the deeper we go, the more you will see your own story reflected in theirs. So we have seen how ancient medicine blamed women's exhaustion on wandering wombs and impossible theories. But while male physicians debated in marble halls, something else was happening in cottages, forests, and village squares. Women were healing each other. They were passing down knowledge that had nothing to do with theory, and everything to do with what actually worked. Let me take you to medieval Europe, to a world most of us only know from fairy tales. But forget the castles and knights for a moment. I want you to imagine a different scene. It is dawn in a small English village, sometime around the year 1200. A woman wakes before the sun. She is not young, perhaps 50, maybe older. Her hands are weathered from years of gathering plants in every season. The village calls her the wise woman. A knock comes at her door. It's a farmer's wife, pale and trembling with exhaustion. She has been up 3 nights with a colicky baby. She has 6 other children to care for. She cannot sleep even when the baby finally does, because her mind races with worry about the harvest, about her aging mother, about feeding everyone through winter. She is so tired she can barely stand, but she cannot afford to be tired. There is no one else to do the work. The wise woman does not tell her that her womb is wandering. She does not prescribe fumigation or prayers. Instead, she goes to her garden, and this is where the real magic happens. She picks chamomile, that humble daisy-like flower we still use today. She picks valerian root, woody and pungent. She picks lavender, fragrant and calming. She brews them into a tea, adds a touch of honey, and gives it to the exhausted woman with instructions. Drink this before bed. Give the baby a few drops in warm water. Come back in 3 days. And here is the remarkable thing, it worked. Not because of magic, not because of divine intervention, but because these plants contain compounds that genuinely affect the human nervous system. Chamomile has apigenin, which binds to receptors in the brain that promote relaxation. Valerian root increases gamma-aminobutyric acid, which reduces neural excitability. Lavender contains linalool, which has demonstrated sedative effects in clinical studies. The wise woman did not know the chemistry. She did not need to. She knew what her mother taught her, and what her grandmother taught before that, stretching back through generations of women who paid attention, who experimented, who remembered what worked. Now you might be wondering, who were these wise women? Were they witches? Were they healers? Were they simply grandmothers with good memories? The answer is all of the above. In medieval society, there was no clear line between magic and medicine, between prayer and plant lore. The wise woman was the village's first responder. If you were exhausted, sick, injured, or giving birth, was the one you called. Not a physician, those were rare and expensive, not a priest, though he might bless you afterward, you called the wise woman. And overwhelmingly, these wise women were experts in one particular problem, female exhaustion. because they lived it themselves. They understood what it meant to be tired to the bone yet unable to rest, to have your body scream for sleep while your responsibilities screamed louder. Let me tell you about one wise woman whose name we actually know. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and she lived in Germany during the 12th century. Now, Hildegard was unusual because she was educated. She was an abbess, the head of a Benedictine monastery. But her knowledge of herbs was the same knowledge that village-wise women used. The difference is that Hildegard wrote it down. In her book Physica, written around 1150, she documented hundreds of remedies. And when you read her descriptions of how to treat exhaustion, you realize she was talking about the same crushing fatigue that women experience today. For women who were weary and weak, Hildegard prescribed a combination of herbs that modern science has now validated. She recommended sage, and we now know sage contains compounds that may improve cognitive function and reduce mental fatigue. She prescribed fennel for women who felt heavy and sluggish, and fennel is still used today as a digestive aid because sometimes fatigue comes from poor nutrition and gut problems. But here is what I find most fascinating about Hildegard. She did not just list herbs, she understood that exhaustion was not just physical. She wrote about the importance of balance, of joy, of music and beauty in healing. She believed that a woman who was exhausted needed more than medicine. She needed her spirit restored. Think about that for a moment. In the 1200s, a woman understood something that modern medicine is only now rediscovering, that fatigue is not just about the body. It is about the mind, the spirit, the life you are living. But Hildegard was privileged. She had the protection of the church and the respect that came with education. Most wise women had no such protection. They lived on the margins of society. They were often poor, often widowed, often alone. And yet they held power, the power of knowledge, the power to ease suffering. Let me tell you about some of the herbs these women used, remedies that have stood the test of time so well that we still use them today. Mugwort. The medieval wise women called it the mother of herbs. It grew wild everywhere, in ditches, along roads, in neglected corners of fields. The poor woman who could not afford a physician's fee could find mugwort for free. They used it for exhaustion, especially the exhaustion that came with women's cycles. They brewed it into tea, they stuffed it into pillows, they hung it over doorways. Modern research is now investigating what medieval women knew instinctively, that mugwort contains compounds that may help regulate menstrual cycles and reduce cramping. When you are bleeding heavily and in pain, when you have to keep working through it, because no one recognizes your discomfort as legitimate, anything that eases that suffering is precious. Rosemary. Remember that old saying, rosemary for remembrance? Medieval women used rosemary for exhausted women who could not think clearly, who felt their minds were foggy and slow. They were right to do so. We now know that rosemary contains compounds that improve blood flow to the brain and may enhance memory and concentration. And here is something beautiful. Medieval women often gave rosemary to new mothers, women who had just given birth and were facing weeks of sleepless nights, women whose bodies were depleted from pregnancy and bleeding. Rosemary in their food, rosemary in their bath water, rosemary by their bedside. It was not just superstition. It was a way of saying, you are not alone. We see how tired you are. Here is something that might help. Nettle. Oh, nettle. That stinging plant that grows in damp places and punishes you if you brush against it carelessly. Medieval wise women knew that if you could get past the sting by drying it, cooking it, or handling it with gloves, nettle was one of the best remedies for the exhausted woman. Why? Because nettle is extraordinarily rich in iron, and many exhausted medieval women, like many exhausted women today, were anemic. They were losing blood through menstruation, through childbirth, through injury. They were not getting enough iron-rich food because meat was expensive and they gave the best portions to their husbands and sons. Nettle gave them a way to rebuild their blood without spending money they did not have. Modern nutrition science confirms this. Nettle contains high levels of iron, vitamin C to help absorb that iron, and other minerals like magnesium that support energy production. The medieval wise women did not know the biochemistry, but they knew that women who drank nettle tea regularly had more energy. They knew that pale, weak women grew stronger, so they kept prescribing it. But here is what breaks my heart about this tradition. It was mostly oral. These women could not write, they could not publish books, they could not open schools, so their knowledge stayed local, personal, passed from mother to daughter in whispers. And when a wise woman died, sometimes her knowledge died with her, unless she had a daughter or apprentice who remembered everything, unless someone wrote it down, like Hildegard did, or like the anonymous compilers of herbals, those medieval manuscripts that preserved plant knowledge. One such herbal, written in the 9th century, was called the Leech Book of Bald. And yes, that really was someone's name. The Leech Book contains remedies that Saxon wise women used, written in Old English. Many of these remedies are for women's ailments, particularly exhaustion after childbirth. The Leech Book recommends a drink made of ale, herbs and honey for women who were weak after giving birth. Was it medicine? Was it nutrition? Was it simply a way to make sure the new mother drank enough fluids? Probably all three. And probably it helped, because dehydration and poor nutrition absolutely do cause fatigue. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever felt so tired that you tried everything, supplements, vitamins, energy drinks, searching desperately for something, anything that would help? If so, you're walking the same path those medieval women walked. They were trying everything too. Most things probably did not work, but some things did. And the ones that worked got passed down. But there is a darker side to this story that we have to talk about. Because as wise women became more respected, more sought after, they also became more threatening to the male physicians who wanted to control medical practice, to the church leaders who distrusted any power they did not control, and eventually to the witch hunters. Starting in the 15th century, Europe descended into the witch trials. Tens of thousands of people were accused of witchcraft, and the vast majority were women. Many were wise women, herbalists, healers, women whose only crime was knowing too much about plants and bodies. If you cured someone with herbs, you might be accused of using demonic magic. If you could not cure someone, you might be accused of cursing them. It was a trap with no escape. The wise women of Europe were gradually erased, their knowledge dismissed as superstition, their gardens destroyed, their reputations ruined. And medicine became the exclusive domain of university-trained men, who ironically often knew far less about what actually worked than the illiterate women they replaced. But here is the thing about knowledge passed between women. It is stubborn. It survives. Even when wise women were killed, their daughters remembered. Even when herbals were burned, someone somewhere had memorized the recipes. The knowledge went underground, became grandmother's remedies, old wives' tales. Diminished, yes. Mocked, certainly, but not entirely lost. And today we are rediscovering what they knew. Modern pharmacology has validated dozens of traditional herbal remedies. Chamomile, valerian, lavender, nettle, sage. All still used, all still effective, all originally championed by women whose names we will never know. So the next time you brew a cup of chamomile tea when you're exhausted, remember, you're drinking the same remedy that a medieval wise woman gave to tired women 800 years ago. The chemistry has not changed. The human body has not changed. And the exhaustion of being a woman in a demanding world has not changed nearly as much as we might wish. But something has changed. We are beginning to remember. We are beginning to honor the women who healed when healing was dangerous, who learned when learning was forbidden, who survived when the world wanted them silenced. Coming up next, we are going inside the monasteries, those quiet stone buildings where nuns preserved not just prayers, but medical knowledge. where women could study, experiment, and write, because the walls of the convent protected them from the accusations and dangers that village-wise women faced. We will meet the women who built gardens of healing, who copied ancient texts, and who kept the flame of medical knowledge alive through Europe's darkest centuries. The story of women fighting exhaustion is also the story of women fighting to be heard, to be believed, to be allowed to know. And that fight is far from over. Picture a stone wall 10 feet high surrounding acres of gardens and buildings. Beyond that wall, the world is dangerous for women who want to learn. But inside is a different world entirely. This is a Benedictine monastery in medieval Germany, around the year 1100. And behind these walls, something remarkable is happening. Women are reading, women are writing, women are studying medicine, and they are doing it all without asking permission from any man. Now, before we go further, let me be clear about something. These women were nuns, sworn to God and the Church, but do not mistake religious devotion for passivity. These women were some of the most educated, most powerful, most intellectually free women in all of medieval Europe, and they used that freedom to preserve knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever. Let me introduce you to someone we met briefly before, but now we will truly get to know her. Hildegard of Bingen, born in 1098 in the Rhineland, the 10th child of a noble family. At age 8, just 8 years old, her parents gave her to the church. This was common for younger daughters of nobility. The family could not afford dowries for all of them, so into the convent they went, but Hildegard's parents made a choice that would change medical history. They did not send her to just any convent. They sent her to one led by a woman named Jutta, who believed in education, who taught her girls to read Latin, who had a garden full of medicinal plants, who believed that healing the body was as holy as healing the soul. Hildegard learned everything. By the time she was in her 30s, she was having visions, mystical experiences she described in vivid detail. The church investigated. Male bishops interrogated her. Was she a heretic? Was she mad? Or was she genuinely touched by God? Here is what saved her. She was brilliant. Her visions were theologically sound. Her Latin was flawless, and she had political connections through her noble birth. So instead of condemning her, the church authorized her. In 1151, the Pope himself gave her permission to write and to preach. Think about what this meant. In an age when most women could not even speak in church, Hildegard was authorized to write books, to give sermons, to advise bishops and kings. She became essentially untouchable, and she used that protection to do something extraordinary. She wrote about medicine. She wrote about women's bodies. She wrote about exhaustion and how to treat it. And she did not ask permission, she simply did it. Her book Causes et Cures, which means causes and cures, is one of the most detailed medieval medical texts about women's health. And when you read what she wrote about fatigue, you realize that she understood something profound. Hildegard wrote about different types of exhaustion. There was exhaustion from hard labor, this was obvious. There was exhaustion from illness, equally obvious. But then she wrote about something else. She wrote about exhaustion of the spirit, about women who were not physically ill, but who felt heavy, sad, unable to find joy or energy in their days. Does this sound familiar? Hildegard was describing depression in the 12th century. Without modern psychology, without our vocabulary for mental health, she recognized that exhaustion was not always physical. Sometimes it was the soul that was tired. And how did she treat it? Not just with herbs, though she prescribed those too. She prescribed music, she prescribed beauty. She prescribed being in nature, tending gardens, creating things with your hands. She believed that a woman whose spirit was exhausted needed to remember how to feel alive. Hildegard herself composed over 70 musical works. She believed music could heal. And modern research on music therapy suggests she was absolutely right. Listening to music can lower cortisol levels, reduce perceived pain, and improve mood in ways that are measurable and real. But Hildegard was not alone. All across medieval Europe, monasteries and convents were becoming centres of medical knowledge. And the reason is simple. They had resources that village-wise women did not. They had libraries, ancient texts from Greece and Rome, carefully copied by hand over centuries, medical knowledge from the Arab world, brought back by travellers and scholars. These books were precious, rare, and expensive. Most people would never see one in their entire lives. But in monasteries, nuns could read them. They had gardens, not just a few herbs in a kitchen plot, but extensive physic gardens designed specifically for growing medicinal plants. Monks and nuns traded seeds across Europe. If a monastery in France had a plant that worked well for fevers, they would send seeds to a monastery in England. Knowledge flowed along the same networks that carried prayers and letters. They had time. Village-wise women had to farm, cook, raise children, manage households. Nuns did have work, plenty of it, but their primary duty was prayer and study. This gave them something most medieval women never had: hours each day to experiment, to observe, to learn, and perhaps most importantly, they had each other. A village might have one wise woman, but a convent might have 50 nuns, each with her own knowledge, her own observations, her own questions. They could compare notes, they could test different approaches, they could build on each other's discoveries. Let me tell you about a specific remedy that came from monastery medicine and changed how exhaustion was treated for centuries. It was called a theriac. The recipe varied from place to place, but the core ingredients were consistent: herbs, honey, wine, and sometimes opium. Nuns would spend days preparing these mixtures, grinding herbs with mortar and pestle, measuring precisely, aging the mixture in clay pots. These theriacs were prescribed for exhaustion, but also for pain, for sleeplessness, for anxiety, and they worked, though sometimes for troubling reasons. The opium in them was genuinely effective at reducing pain and inducing sleep, but it was also addictive. This is one of those moments where medieval medicine stumbled onto something powerful but could not understand the full consequences. Still, the fact that nuns were creating complex medicines, writing down precise recipes, and distributing them to the sick shows you the level of sophistication we are talking about. This was not superstition. This was experimental pharmacology, conducted by women, written by women, for the benefit of other women. Now you might be wondering, if nuns had all this knowledge and protection, why did not more women join convents? The answer is both simple and heartbreaking. It cost money. You needed a dowry to enter most convents, just as you needed a dowry to marry. Poor women could not afford either option. So while noble and merchant class women could escape into convents and pursue learning, peasant women, the vast majority, remained trapped by poverty and exhaustion with no escape. But there is one group of women I want to tell you about who changed this dynamic. They were called beguines, and they were radical. Starting in the 13th century, groups of women in Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands began forming their own communities. They were not nuns. They took no permanent vows. They did not need dowries. They simply lived together, supported themselves through work like weaving and nursing, and created their own small havens of female autonomy. And many beguines became healers. They visited the sick in their homes, they ran hospitals, they grew medicinal herbs and made remedies. Essentially, they took the monastery model of collective female knowledge and made it accessible to women who could not afford convent life. The church was suspicious of them. Male authorities did not like women who lived independently, who made their own rules, who did not submit to either husband or bishop. Some beguines were accused of heresy. Some were burned at the stake, but the movement survived for centuries because it met a desperate need. The need for women to have some control over their own lives, including their health. Let me share something specific that beguines contributed to treating exhaustion. They developed what we might call occupational therapy before that term existed. They recognized that women who are exhausted from one type of work might actually be restored by a different type of work. A woman exhausted from hard physical labor might be given needlework to do, something that kept her hands busy but let her body rest. A woman exhausted from being trapped indoors with children might be sent to work in gardens, physical labor, yes, but outdoors, with fresh air and sunshine. A woman exhausted from isolation might be brought into the community workspace where other women were weaving or spinning, where she could work alongside others, talk, laugh, feel less alone. Does this sound familiar? We are rediscovering what Beguines knew 800 years ago, that human beings need variety, need community, need work that feels meaningful. That exhaustion is not just about sleep debt. It is about what you are exhausted from and what you're exhausted toward. But let us return to the monasteries for a moment, because I want to tell you about one more extraordinary woman. Her name was Trota of Salerno, and she lived in 11th century Italy. Now, technically, Trota was not a nun, but she was connected to the medical school at Salerno, which was closely tied to monastic traditions. And she did something almost unheard of. She wrote a comprehensive medical text specifically about women's health. The book that bears her name, though scholars debate exactly who wrote what, is called the Trotula, and it is astonishingly detailed about treating female exhaustion, especially exhaustion related to childbirth and reproductive health. The Trotula recommends specific herbs for women who are exhausted after giving birth. Fennel to increase milk production because women who could not nurse their babies were racked with anxiety and guilt, which worsened exhaustion. Mugwort for cramping and heavy bleeding because how can you rest when you're in constant pain? Pennyroyal in small amounts for fatigue, though we now know pennyroyal can be dangerous in large doses, so medieval women were walking a fine line. But here is what impresses me most about the Trotula. It recognizes that women's exhaustion is not just biological. The text recommends that women who have just given birth should be cared for by other women, that they should be given good food and warm drinks, that they should be kept warm and allowed to rest, that they should not be expected to immediately resume all their duties. In other words, postpartum care, rest, community support. These medieval healers understood that recovery from childbirth required more than herbs. It required acknowledgement that birth takes a toll and that women deserve time to heal. Compare this to what happened in later centuries when male physicians took over obstetrics. Women were often given no recovery time. Wealthy women might have a lying-in period, but poor women were back to work within days, sometimes hours. The knowledge that the Trotula preserved, the knowledge of how to care for exhausted new mothers, was dismissed as old wives' tales, and women suffered for it. Puerperal fever killed thousands, exhaustion killed thousands more. Not directly perhaps, but exhaustion weakens the immune system, makes you more susceptible to infection, makes it harder to fight off disease. Those medieval nuns knew this, but their knowledge was forgotten or ignored or actively suppressed. So here is what I want you to understand about monastery medicine. Yes, these women were privileged. Yes, they had resources most women did not, but they used those resources to preserve knowledge that benefited all women. They wrote it down so it would not be lost. They copied texts so the knowledge would spread. They trained younger women so the tradition would continue. When I hold a cup of chamomile tea, I'm holding something that was grown in monastery gardens, documented in monastery texts, prescribed by monastery healers. That knowledge survived because women behind stone walls fought to preserve it. But those walls could only protect them for so long. As we move forward through history, we will see how the rise of universities, the professionalization of medicine, and the witch trials combined to strip women of their role as healers. We will see how knowledge was lost, how women were pushed out, how exhaustion went from a recognized condition with established treatments to something dismissed as feminine weakness. Next, we are diving into one of the strangest periods in medical history, the age of the four humours. We will explore how medieval doctors believed that exhaustion came from an imbalance of bodily fluids and how their treatments, bloodletting, leeches and bizarre diets, often made exhaustion far worse. But we will also discover the surprising moments when they stumbled onto treatments that actually helped, even if they completely misunderstood why. The battle between what works and what theory says should work is about to get very, very strange. There is a moment in medical history when everything hinged on a single belief that your body contained four fluids, and if those fluids fell out of balance, you would become sick, exhausted, or even die. And for over 1,000 years, this theory dominated how women's fatigue was understood and treated. Sometimes brilliantly, sometimes catastrophically, and occasionally almost by accident in ways that actually helped. Welcome to the world of humoral medicine, where blood could be too hot, bile could be too dry, and your exhaustion was blamed on having too much dampness in your spleen. It sounds absurd now, but millions of women were treated according to these principles. And here is the strange thing. Some of them got better. Let me take you back to around 400 years before Christ, to the island of Kos in Greece. This is where Hippocrates established his medical school, and where he developed a theory that would shape medicine for the next 2,000 years. Hippocrates looked at the world around him and saw four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Everything in nature, he believed, was made of these four elements in different combinations, so it made sense to him that the human body would also contain four corresponding substances: blood, which was hot and moist like air; phlegm, which was cold and moist like water; yellow bile, which was hot and dry like fire; and black bile, which was cold and dry like earth. When these four humours were perfectly balanced, you were healthy. But when one humour became excessive or deficient, you fell ill, and different imbalances caused different symptoms. Now, here is where it gets interesting for exhausted women. Hippocrates believed that women were naturally colder and wetter than men. This was not an insult. It was simply their theory of biology. Women menstruated, which proved they had excess moisture that needed to be expelled monthly. Women's bodies were softer, which suggested more phlegm. Women ran cooler, which meant less fire, less yellow bile. And exhaustion? According to humoral theory, exhaustion came from an excess of phlegm or black bile. Both were cold, heavy humours that weighed you down, made you sluggish, clouded your mind. So if you were a medieval woman who went to a physician complaining of exhaustion, he would examine you, not with instruments, but with observation. He would look at your complexion. Was it pale? That suggested too much phlegm. Was it sallow or yellowish? That suggested black bile, what they called melancholy. He would ask about your digestion. Were you constipated? More black bile. Did you have mucus? Too much phlegm. He would check your pulse, feel your skin temperature, even examine your urine in a glass flask, looking at its colour and clarity. And then he would prescribe treatment designed to restore balance. This is where things get both fascinating and frightening. Let us say the physician diagnosed you with excess phlegm. You were cold and wet, so you needed to be made warm and dry. He might prescribe heating foods, meat, especially game, wine instead of water, spices like pepper and ginger. He would tell you to exercise, to move your body to generate heat. He might also prescribe warming herbs. Remember rosemary from our discussion of wise women? Rosemary was considered hot and dry in humoral theory, so it was perfect for a cold, phlegmatic woman. And here is the surprising part. It probably helped. Not because it balanced humours, those do not actually exist, but because rosemary improves circulation and may enhance alertness. A woman who was lethargic and cold might genuinely feel better after rosemary treatment. But now let us talk about the treatment that terrifies us most when we look back at medieval medicine: bloodletting. If a physician believed you had too much blood, If you were flushed, felt hot, had headaches along with your exhaustion, he might recommend bleeding. And I am not talking about a tiny amount. Sometimes they would drain a pint or more of blood from a patient. The theory was that excess blood made you overwrought, overstimulated, unable to rest properly. By removing some blood, they would cool you down and restore balance. Now here is the horrifying truth. For exhausted women, bloodletting was often disastrous. Many women's exhaustion came from anemia, from not having enough iron, from losing blood through heavy menstruation or childbirth. The last thing they needed was to lose more blood. But some women did report feeling better after bloodletting, and here is why. If your exhaustion came from high blood pressure, from stress and tension, then yes, removing some blood volume might temporarily lower your blood pressure and make you feel calmer. But this was treating the symptom, not the cause. And for every woman who felt temporarily better, 10 more were made worse. Let me tell you a specific story that illustrates both the brilliance and the blindness of humoral medicine. In the 13th century, there was a noble woman in France, we know her only as Lady Marguerite, whose case was documented by her physician. She was constantly exhausted. She could barely rise from bed most days. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. She had no appetite. She wept frequently. Her physician diagnosed her with an excess of black bile, melancholy. This was the most serious of the humour imbalances, associated with deep sadness and exhaustion. His treatment plan was complex. First, diet. She was to eat warm, moist foods to counteract the cold, dry nature of black bile. Chicken soup, soft bread soaked in broth, ripe fruits, sweet wine. Second, light and warmth. She was to sit by windows where sunlight could reach her. Her rooms were to be kept warm with fires. She was to be dressed in bright colours because black bile was associated with darkness. Third, gentle activity. Short walks in gardens, music and pleasant conversation. She was specifically ordered not to be left alone with her thoughts. Fourth, herbal remedies. St. John's wort, which was considered hot and dry, perfect for opposing black bile. Saffron in her food, rose water to lift her spirits. Now, read that treatment plan again, but forget the humours theory. What is the physician actually prescribing? Nutritious food, sunlight exposure, physical activity, social connection, St. John's wort, which we now know has mild antidepressant properties. This physician, working in the 13th century, with a completely wrong theory of how the body works, accidentally prescribed an effective treatment for what we would now call depression with severe fatigue. Lady Marguerite recovered. The physician believed it was because he had rebalanced her humours. The truth was probably that he had addressed her nutritional deficiencies, gotten her outside and moving, treated her depression, and given her the social support she desperately needed. This is the paradox of humoral medicine. The theory was nonsense, but the observations that informed the theory were often quite good. Medieval physicians noticed that exhausted patients improved with better food, or with exercise, with social connection, with certain herbs. They just explained it all wrong. But let me show you where humoral theory went dangerously wrong. Because physicians believed that women were naturally cold and wet, they often prescribed treatments to make women hotter and drier. This led to some truly bizarre and harmful practices. Some physicians prescribed cauterization. They would burn the skin with hot irons to draw out excess moisture. Imagine being an exhausted woman and having someone burn your flesh as treatment. The pain alone would make your exhaustion worse, never mind the risk of infection. Others prescribe purgatives, powerful herbs that would make you vomit or have violent diarrhea. The theory was that you were expelling excess phlegm or black bile. The reality was that you were becoming dehydrated and losing essential nutrients, which obviously made fatigue worse. And then there were the leeches. Oh, the leeches. Leeches were used for bloodletting because they were more precise than cutting a vein. You could place leeches on specific body parts to remove excess blood from that area. temples for headaches, the lower back for menstrual complaints, the chest for breathing difficulties. Now, here is something wild. Sometimes leech therapy actually helped with certain conditions. Leeches secrete a compound called hirudin, which is an anticoagulant. For patients with clotting disorders or localized inflammation, leeches could genuinely provide relief. In fact, leeches are still used in modern medicine for very specific purposes, like restoring blood flow after reattachment surgery. But for exhausted women, for women who are anemic and depleted, leeches were a nightmare. They were literally draining blood from women who desperately needed to build their blood up. I want you to imagine being a peasant woman in medieval England. You are exhausted because you have borne 6 children. You are poorly nourished. You work from dawn to dusk and you probably have intestinal parasites that are stealing what few nutrients you get. You finally scrape together enough money to see a physician. He examines you, notes your pale complexion and low energy, and diagnoses excess phlegm. He prescribes bloodletting with leeches. You're too tired and too intimidated to argue, so you let him attach leeches to your skin. They drink your blood. You become even more anemic. Your exhaustion gets worse. But here is the cruelest part. When you return and tell the physician you're worse, he does not question his theory. He concludes that you still have too much phlegm and prescribes more leeches. This actually happened. We have medical records showing physicians treating the same exhausted patients repeatedly with bloodletting, each time making them worse, never questioning whether the theory itself might be wrong. Why did humoral theory persist for so long, despite evidence that it often failed? There are several reasons. First, confirmation bias. When a treatment worked, even if it worked for the wrong reasons, that confirmed the theory. When a treatment failed, physicians blamed the patient or said the imbalance was too severe. Second, the theory was elegant. It explained everything. Every symptom, every disease, every variation in human temperament. All could be attributed to the humours. It was a complete system that seemed to make sense of the chaotic world of illness. Third, it gave physicians authority. If you understood the humours, you understood medicine. It was esoteric knowledge that separated educated physicians from common healers. To abandon humoral theory would be to admit that maybe the illiterate wise women with their simple herb gardens knew as much as you did. But here is what I find most interesting. Even as humoral theory failed women over and over, women kept seeking care. They kept trying to find relief for their exhaustion, and they learned to navigate the system. Smart women learned which physicians were competent and which were dangerous. They learned to describe their symptoms in terms physicians expected to hear. If saying you had excess phlegm got you a gentler treatment than saying you were just tired, you learned to say you had excess phlegm. Women also learned to combine official medicine with traditional remedies. You would see the physician because your husband insisted, or because social pressure demanded it. But you would also visit the wise woman for herbs that actually helped. You would do both, covering all your bases, hoping something would work. And sometimes, just sometimes, the two systems aligned. A physician trained in humoral theory might prescribe the same herbs that your grandmother used, just for different reasons. He thought they balanced humours. She knew they helped you sleep. Both of you were happy. This is why medical history is so complex. It is not a simple story of ignorance gradually overcome by knowledge. It is a story of different systems of understanding, sometimes competing, sometimes complementing each other, all trying to address real human suffering. And women were caught in the middle, trying to survive with theories that did not serve them, seeking healing wherever they could find it. But the age of the four humours was ending. New ideas were stirring. The Renaissance was coming, and with it, a revolution in how we understood the human body. Anatomy would replace theory, observation would replace assumption. Or would it? Because as we will discover next, the fall of humoral medicine did not automatically mean better treatment for exhausted women. In fact, as medicine became more modern, it became more male-dominated, and that would bring its own problems. Coming up, we are travelling to Salerno, to the most advanced medical school in medieval Europe, a place where, for a brief, shining moment, women could study medicine alongside men. We will meet the physicians of Salerno, explore their revolutionary treatments for female fatigue, and discover why this beacon of progress was ultimately snuffed out by the forces of tradition and patriarchy. The journey from theory to practice, from balance to breakthrough, is about to take a dramatic turn. Imagine a place where women could walk into a medical school and no one questioned whether they belonged there, where female physicians taught male students, where the most comprehensive textbook on women's health was written, copied, and distributed across Europe, where exhausted women could seek treatment from doctors who actually listened to them. This place existed. It was called Salerno, and for about 300 years, it was the most advanced centre of medical learning in all of Europe. And then, almost as suddenly as it rose, it was suppressed. Its radical ideas buried, its women physicians erased from history. Until recently, most people had never even heard of it. Let me take you to southern Italy, to a coastal town blessed with warm climate and natural hot springs. The year is around 950 and something extraordinary is happening. Salerno sits at a crossroads. Ships arrive from Constantinople bringing Greek medical texts. Arab merchants bring knowledge from the Islamic Golden Age, where medicine has advanced far beyond what Europe knows. Jewish scholars arrive with their own medical traditions, and somehow, miraculously, these different cultures begin to share their knowledge. The medical school that emerges from this cultural melting pot is unlike anything Europe has seen. It is not controlled by the church, though the church tolerates it. It is not restricted to the nobility, though nobles certainly study there. And most remarkably, it welcomes women, not just as patients, as students, as teachers, as physicians. Now, before you picture some progressive utopia, let me be clear. This was still medieval Italy. Women who studied medicine at Salerno were exceptional, often from wealthy families, and they still faced enormous barriers. But the fact that they could study at all was revolutionary, and the woman whose legacy would reshape women's healthcare for someone we have mentioned before, but now we will truly understand. Her name was Trota, sometimes spelled Trotula, and the mystery surrounding her tells us everything about how history treats brilliant women. For centuries, male scholars insisted that Trota could not have existed. They claimed that the medical texts attributed to her were obviously written by a man, because no woman could possess such sophisticated knowledge. Some said Trota was just a corruption of the Latin word tractatus, meaning treatise. Others suggested she was a fictional character, a convenient myth. But modern scholarship has proven them wrong. Trota was real. She lived in 11th century Salerno. She practiced medicine. She taught. And she wrote what would become the most influential book on women's health in medieval Europe. The text we know as the Trotula is actually a compilation of 3 separate works, and scholars now believe Trota wrote at least one of them, on the treatments for women. And when you read what she wrote about treating exhausted women, you realize you're in the hands of someone who truly understood. Trota recognized that women's exhaustion had multiple causes, not just one imbalanced humor, but a complex interaction of factors. She wrote about exhaustion from difficult childbirth, from prolonged breastfeeding when the mother herself was malnourished, from heavy menstrual bleeding that left women pale and weak, from the emotional toll of losing children, which was tragically common. And here is what makes her approach so revolutionary. She prescribed different treatments for different causes. For women exhausted from blood loss, she recommended iron-rich foods, liver especially, red meat when they could afford it, and a particular plant called shepherd's purse, which we now know does help reduce bleeding. She was not just guessing, she was observing patterns and prescribing accordingly. For women exhausted from the demands of breastfeeding, she recommended foods to increase milk production, fennel, dill, and anise. But also, and this is crucial, She recommended that wealthy women hire wet nurses so they could rest. She understood that a mother who was depleted could not adequately nourish her child. For women suffering from what we would now call postpartum depression, exhaustion, mixed with deep sadness and detachment, Trotter prescribed a period of rest, warm baths, massage, and the presence of other women. Not isolation, which was common in medieval practice, but community. Think about this. In the 11th century, a female physician was distinguishing between physical exhaustion and emotional exhaustion and prescribing treatments that addressed both. But Trotter went even further. She wrote about sexual health, about pleasure, about the connection between a woman's emotional state and her physical well-being. In an age when most male physicians barely acknowledge that women experience sexual pleasure, Trotter wrote detailed instructions on how to address painful intercourse, how to restore vaginal lubrication, how to help women who had been traumatized by difficult births. Why? Because she understood that a woman who was in pain, who dreaded intimacy, who felt disconnected from her own body would be exhausted, not just physically but in her spirit. The Trotula became one of the most copied medical texts of the Middle Ages. We have manuscripts from the 12th, 13th, 14th and 15th centuries translated into multiple languages, distributed across Europe. For hundreds of years, when physicians needed to treat women, they consulted Trotter's work. But here is where the story takes a dark turn. As universities began to form and medicine became increasingly professionalized, women were systematically excluded. By the 13th century, Paris established strict rules. Only men who had studied at approved universities could practice medicine. Women were forbidden from attending universities, therefore women could not become licensed physicians. Salerno held out longer than most places, but eventually even Salerno bowed to pressure. By the 14th century, female students became rare. By the 15th century, they had vanished entirely, and as women disappeared from medical practice, something else happened. The Trotula was revised. Male editors added sections, changed language, inserted their own theories. Some editions even changed the author's name to Trottus, making her male. Because if the text was valuable, how could it have been written by a woman? But let me tell you about one specific treatment from the Trotula that shows just how sophisticated Salerno medicine was. Trotter described a condition she called suffocation of the womb. Now this sounds like it might be related to the ancient wandering womb theory, but it was actually something different. She was describing what we might now recognize as severe anxiety or panic attacks, particularly in women who had experienced difficult or traumatic births. These women would feel tightness in their chest, difficulty breathing, racing heart, overwhelming fear. Medieval physicians often dismissed this as hysteria, or prescribed brutal treatments like cauterization. Trotter took a completely different approach. She recommended aromatherapy, specific scents, rose, lavender, mint, to calm the nervous system. She recommended breathing exercises, having the woman focus on slow, deep breaths. She recommended gentle massage, and she recommended that the woman not be left alone during these episodes, but surrounded by calm, supportive female companions. Now, compare this to modern treatment for panic attacks. We teach breathing exercises, we use aromatherapy, we emphasize the importance of support systems. Trotter figured this out 900 years ago, but she was not alone. Salerno produced multiple female physicians whose names we know. There was Abella, who wrote medical treatises on bile and the nature of women. There was Rebecca Guana, who studied fevers and the treatment of wounds. There was Mercuriade, who specialized in surgery and the treatment of skin conditions. These were not midwives working in the shadows. These were university-trained physicians who wrote textbooks, who taught students, who were consulted on complex cases. And what happened to their legacy? Most of their writings were lost or destroyed. Their names were struck from official records, and for centuries medical historians insisted they never existed. It took modern feminist scholars digging through archives, finding fragments of manuscripts, piecing together evidence to prove that yes, these women were real. Yes, they practiced medicine. Yes, they contributed to medical knowledge. And yes, they were deliberately erased. Now let me tell you about one more treatment from Salerno that specifically addressed female exhaustion, because it reveals something important about how they understood women's lives. Salerno physicians recognized what they called the exhaustion of widows, women who had lost their husbands and suddenly found themselves responsible for everything, managing estates, raising children alone, defending their legal rights while also grieving. The treatment was not bloodletting or purgatives, it was practical support. Salerno physicians would write letters to local authorities recommending that the widow be given assistance. They would prescribe nutritious food and ensure she had access to it. They would recommend that other women in the community check on her regularly. In other words, they treated exhaustion as a social problem, not just a medical one. Can you imagine if modern medicine approached exhaustion this way? If your doctor, seeing that you were overwhelmed, could write a prescription for community support, for practical help, for the things you actually need. Salerno understood something we are only now rediscovering, that you cannot treat exhaustion without addressing the life circumstances that cause it. But the Salerno model was an anomaly. As we move forward in history, medicine becomes increasingly dominated by university-trained men who have never experienced pregnancy, never nursed a child, never menstruated, yet claim absolute authority over women's bodies. And the treatments for exhaustion, they get stranger, more removed from reality, and in some cases far more dangerous than anything we've seen so far. However, before we leave Salerno, I want you to hold on to something. For 300 years, in one corner of medieval Europe, it was possible. Women could be doctors. Women's medical knowledge was valued. Women's exhaustion was taken seriously and treated with understanding and sophistication. It was possible once, which means it could be possible again. But first, we have to travel through some very dark territory. Because as medicine advanced in some ways, it regressed catastrophically in others, and women would pay the price. What did medieval society do when it saw women with knowledge, women with power, women who could heal? In our next part, we confront one of the darkest chapters in this story, the witch trials. We will meet the healers who are accused of witchcraft simply for knowing too much about herbs. We will hear the testimonies of women who were tortured for healing their neighbours, and we will see how the systematic destruction of female medical practitioners changed healthcare for centuries. The wise women, the herbalists, the healers, they did not just fade away, they were hunted, and the loss of their knowledge would have consequences that echo into our present day. The story gets darker before it gets lighter, but I promise you there is light ahead. Women's resistance, women's knowledge, women's refusal to be tamed. These things cannot be completely destroyed. They can only be buried, and buried things have a way of rising again. She was 63 years old, her hands were gnarled from decades of gathering herbs in all seasons. She had delivered over 200 babies in her village. She had treated fevers, set broken bones, brewed remedies for exhaustion that had helped countless women survive their grueling lives. And on a cold morning in 1582 they came for her. Her name was Walpurga Hausmannin, and she lived in Bavaria. Her crime? Healing. Her punishment? Death by burning. This is the part of the story that haunts me most, because for hundreds of years we have followed the thread of women's knowledge about treating exhaustion. We have seen it passed from mother to daughter, preserved in monasteries, taught in medical schools. We have watched it grow more sophisticated, more effective, more compassionate, and then, in the span of about 300 years, from roughly 1400 to 1700, much of that knowledge was deliberately destroyed. The women who carried it were hunted, tortured, and killed. We call it the witch trials, but that sanitized term hides a darker truth. This was the systematic elimination of female healers. Now, I need to be clear about something from the start. Not every woman accused of witchcraft was a healer. The witch trials targeted many types of women. Those who were too independent, too outspoken, too poor, too old, too wealthy, too anything that made men uncomfortable. The accusations were often rooted in personal grudges, property disputes, or simply hysteria. But a disproportionate number of accused witches were healers. Women who knew about herbs, women who could ease pain, women who helped other women through exhaustion, through difficult births, through the endless demands of medieval and early modern life. And that made them dangerous, not because they were actually practicing magic, but because they held knowledge and power that existed outside male control. Let me tell you what happened when the wise women started to disappear. In the early 1500s, a German town called Nordlingen kept meticulous records. Before the witch trials intensified in their region, the town had 7 known female healers. These women treated everything from fevers to exhaustion to difficult pregnancies. Then the trials began. Between 1590 and 1600, 5 of those 7 women were accused of witchcraft. 3 were executed. 1 died under torture. 1 fled and was never heard from again after that. The town had 2 remaining healers, both elderly, both terrified to practice openly. When they died within a few years of each other, there was no one to replace them. The knowledge they carried, recipes for remedies, techniques for treating exhaustion, wisdom accumulated over lifetimes, died with them. The town's solution? They hired a university-trained male physician. He had never delivered a baby. He had never helped a woman through exhaustion or postpartum recovery. His training was entirely theoretical, based on texts and humoral theory. Women's healthcare in that town got dramatically worse, and this pattern repeated across Europe, hundreds of times. But why? Why did this happen? What sparked this campaign of terror against female healers? The answer is complicated, but several factors converged. First, the professionalization of medicine. As universities established medical schools and created licensing requirements, they explicitly excluded women. But unlicensed healers, mostly women, continued to practice because people needed them. University-trained physicians resented the competition and pushed for laws against unlicensed practice. Second, the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation created religious turmoil. Both sides became obsessed with rooting out heresy and diabolical influence. Healing with herbs started to be seen as potentially demonic, especially if it worked too well. How could an uneducated woman cure someone unless she had help from the devil? Third, economic pressure. The Little Ice Age from roughly 1300 to 1850 brought crop failures, famines, and disease. Communities under stress look for scapegoats, and old women who lived alone, who had no family to protect them, who survived by selling remedies. They made easy targets. Fourth, and this is crucial, misogyny. The witch trials disproportionately targeted women. About 75 to 85% of all accused witches were female. The very characteristics that made someone a good healer, living independently, being knowledgeable, being older and experienced, were the same characteristics that made a woman seem threatening and unnatural to patriarchal society. Now let me share a specific case that shows you how this played out, because the details matter. In 1635, in the Scottish town of Prestonpans, a woman named Isabel Inch was accused of witchcraft. The evidence against her. She had successfully treated a young woman who had been exhausted and bedridden for months after a difficult childbirth. Here is what actually happened. The young woman, Margaret, had developed what we would now recognize as severe postpartum depression combined with anemia. She could barely get out of bed. She wept constantly. The local physician had bled her repeatedly, which of course made her anemia worse. Isabel gave Margaret iron-rich broths. She brewed nettle tea. She arranged for other women in the community to help with the baby so Margaret could rest. She made poultices with comfrey for Margaret's perineal tears that had not healed properly, and Margaret recovered. The physician was furious. How dare an uneducated woman succeed where he had failed? He reported Isabel to the authorities, claiming that no natural remedy could have worked so well, therefore Isabel must have used witchcraft. Isabel was arrested. During her interrogation, she was asked to reveal her source of knowledge. She said her mother had taught her, and her grandmother before that. This was seen as proof of a diabolical tradition passed down through generations. She was tortured, sleep deprivation, thumbscrews, being forced to stand for days, until she confessed to having made a pact with the devil. Then she was strangled and burned. Margaret, the woman she had saved, was forced to testify against her. She had to stand before the court and denounce Isabel or be accused herself. Imagine living with that guilt. After Isabel's execution, Margaret's depression returned. She had lost not just her healer, but the one woman who had truly understood what she was going through. The physician resumed treating her with bloodletting. She died 2 years later, weakened and broken. This story is not unique. It is the pattern that repeated thousands of times across Europe. And here is what breaks my heart most. The remedies that got women accused of witchcraft, many of them actually worked. We can verify this now with modern science. Nettle for anemia? Yes, it is high in iron. Willow bark for pain? Yes, it contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Chamomile for anxiety and sleeplessness? Yes, it has genuine sedative properties. St. John's wort for melancholy? Yes, it has mild antidepressant effects. These women were not practicing magic. They were practicing effective medicine based on generations of careful observation and experimentation. But because they were women, because they lacked formal credentials, because their knowledge threatened the male medical establishment, they were branded as witches. Now, you might be wondering, did any women survive? Did any of this knowledge make it through? Some did, but they had to hide, they had to practice in secret. They had to pretend they were just making food, just tidying gardens, just gossiping with neighbours. The remedies survived disguised as grandmothers' recipes, old wives' tales, folk traditions, but much was lost, irrevocably, tragically lost. We know this because when we compare medieval medical texts that documented herbal remedies, texts like the Trotula, texts written in monasteries, to what survived in folk practice by the 18th century, there are gaps. Entire categories of treatment simply disappeared. The knowledge of how to treat certain conditions was gone, erased along with the women who carried it. And women's exhaustion became harder to treat, not easier, because the experts had been killed. Let me share something that shows just how absurd the accusations became. In 1647 in England, a woman named Joan Peterson was accused of witchcraft because she successfully treated a patient's exhaustion when other remedies had failed. The prosecution argued, if her remedy worked, it must be supernatural. If it is supernatural, it must be demonic. Therefore, she is a witch. Read that logic again. She was condemned for being too effective. Joan's remedy, by the way, it was a tea made from hawthorn berries, valerian root and honey. We now know that hawthorn supports cardiovascular health, valerian aids sleep, and honey provides quick energy and has antimicrobial properties. It was a perfectly sensible treatment for someone exhausted and weak, but Joan was hanged, and her remedy was forgotten in England for over a century, surviving only in oral traditions that women whispered to each other in private. The scale of this loss is hard to fully comprehend. The most commonly cited number for witch trial executions across Europe and North America is between 40,000 and 60,000 people, but some historians believe the real number could be much higher, possibly over 100,000. Even if we use the conservative estimate, and even if only half of those executed were healers, that is still 20,000 to 30,000 practitioners eliminated. 20,000 to 30,000 repositories of medical knowledge destroyed. Imagine if today we suddenly executed every nurse, every midwife, every herbalist, every acupuncturist, every person who practices any form of traditional or complementary medicine. Imagine the knowledge that would be lost, the patients who would suffer, the gap in healthcare that would open. That is what the witch trials did. And the irony? Male physicians stepped into that gap, claiming authority over women's bodies and women's exhaustion. But they were less equipped, less experienced, and often less compassionate than the women they replaced. I want to pause here and acknowledge something. This is a dark part of our story. It is uncomfortable to sit with. The injustice of it, the cruelty, the waste, it is enraging and heartbreaking in equal measure. But I also want you to see the resilience. Because even in the face of torture and execution, women continued to heal. They did it more carefully, more quietly. They taught their daughters to never write anything down, to never accept payment that could be traced, to never claim their cures were anything but luck or prayer. The knowledge went underground, it became fragmented and partial, but it survived. And when the witch trials finally ended, when the Age of Enlightenment brought reason and skepticism to replace superstition and fear, women slowly, carefully began to reclaim their role as healers. But they would face new obstacles, because by the time the witch trials ended, the medical profession had fully institutionalized itself as a male domain. Universities, licensing boards, professional associations, all closed to women. The battle was not over. It was just entering a new phase. As we move forward, we are leaving behind the world of herbs and village healers and entering the age of formal medicine. We are about to meet women who had to fight not just to practice medicine, but to even study it. Women who had to disguise themselves, who had to sue universities, who had to endure mockery and harassment. But we are also going to see something else. We are going to see how the Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern cities created new forms of female exhaustion. We are going to meet women who could not escape to gardens, and wise women, because they were trapped in factories, in tenements, in lives of grinding poverty that no amount of nettle tea could fix. The fight to treat women's exhaustion is about to become inseparable from the fight for women's rights, women's safety, women's very survival in a rapidly changing world. And the women who led that fight, they were extraordinary. Flawed, yes, privileged often, but determined to make sure that what happened during the witch trials would never happen again. The story grows more complex from here, but also more hopeful, because buried knowledge has a way of rising, and silenced voices find ways to speak. The ship rocked for 73 days. Below deck, in darkness barely broken by candlelight, women and children huddled together, sick, terrified, exhausted before they even reached the New World. When Sarah Kemble Knight finally stepped onto Massachusetts soil in 1695, she was already more tired than she had ever been in her life, and her exhaustion was only beginning. This is where our story crosses the Atlantic. We are leaving behind European villages and medical schools, witch trials and monastery gardens. We are entering a world where there were no physicians at all for hundreds of miles. No wise women with generations of knowledge. No herbalists with established gardens. Just wilderness, danger, and women who had to figure out how to survive with almost nothing. And yet they did survive. And in surviving, they created their own medicine, their own remedies for exhaustion, their own ways of coping when every day threatened to break them. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life looked like for a colonial woman in early America, because until you understand the sheer physical demand, you cannot understand the exhaustion. You wake before dawn because there is no sleeping past sunrise when the animals need feeding and the fire needs tending. You milk the cow, gather eggs, carry water from the well, 50, 60, sometimes there's 100 trips a day depending on the size of your family and whether you're doing laundry. You cook 3 meals from scratch, not opening packages, not reheating leftovers. From scratch, you need bread, churn butter, preserve whatever food you can for winter, because if you do not, your family will starve. You spin thread, weave cloth, sew all the family's clothing by hand. You make soap from animal fat and lye. You make candles because you cannot afford to buy them. You tend the garden, preserve the harvest, care for the sick, nurse babies, teach children, and help your husband with fieldwork when he needs it. And you do all of this while pregnant or nursing or recovering from childbirth. The average colonial woman had 7 to 10 children. Many had more. Some pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, which brought its own exhaustion of grief and physical depletion. Now imagine doing all of this with no coffee. Coffee did not become common in the colonies until the mid-1700s. No modern conveniences, no running water, no electricity, no ability to rest when you were exhausted because there was always more work. How did women survive this? They learned to steal rest in moments. They learned which herbs growing wild in the New World could help them. And they learned to rely on each other in ways that went beyond friendship into something more primal, mutual survival. Let me tell you about a specific remedy that spread through the colonies, passed from woman to woman, that helped with exhaustion in a way that might surprise you. Sassafras tea. Now, if you know anything about sassafras, you might be thinking, wait, is that not the plant that was banned because it contains saffrole, a potentially carcinogenic compound? Yes, it is. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, colonial women did not know about saffrole. They only knew that sassafras tea gave them energy when they were dragging. And here is the thing, it actually did. Sassafras contains compounds that stimulate circulation and have mild stimulant properties. Not as powerful as coffee, but when coffee was unavailable or unaffordable, sassafras was what they had. A cup of sassafras tea in the morning helped a woman face another day of crushing labour. But they also discovered something else. Sassafras tea helped with the aches and pains that came from constant physical work. It has mild analgesic and anti-inflammatory properties. A woman whose back hurt from hauling water, whose hands were raw from washing clothes, whose whole body ached from endless labour, she could get some relief from sassafras. Was it safe? By modern standards, regular consumption of sassafras is not recommended. But when your alternative is collapsing from exhaustion and leaving your children without a mother, you make different calculations. Another plant that became crucial was ginseng. Not Asian ginseng, which was expensive and hard to get, but American ginseng, which grew wild in forests from Georgia to Maine. Indigenous peoples taught colonists about ginseng, and women quickly recognized its value. Ginseng is what we now call an adaptogen, a substance that helps the body resist different kinds of stress. For exhausted colonial women, ginseng tea became a lifeline. Here is what fascinates me about this. Colonial women were rediscovering independently the same category of remedy that had been used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. They did not have the term adaptogen. They just knew that when they drank ginseng tea regularly, they could handle more. They got sick less often. They recovered faster. Modern research has validated this. Ginseng does support adrenal function. It does help with stress response. It does improve stamina. Those exhausted colonial women were right. But let me tell you about something that helped even more than herbs, the quilting bee. Now, you might be thinking, quilting? That is work, not rest. How does that help with exhaustion? Here is what you need to understand. Colonial women were isolated. Farms were spread out. You might not see another woman for weeks at a time. The loneliness was crushing. The burden of carrying all your problems alone was exhausting in itself. The quilting bee was revolutionary. Women would gather at one woman's house, bringing fabric scraps and needles. Officially, they were there to work, to create quilts that families desperately needed. But what actually happened was magic. They talked, they shared their struggles, they gave each other advice about teething babies and difficult husbands and how to make their food supplies last through winter. They laughed together, they cried together, they reminded each other that they were not alone. And yes, they shared medical knowledge. Which herbs helped with what ailments, how to treat a fever, what to do when you were so tired you could barely stand but still had to keep working. The quilting bee was not just about making quilts. It was therapy. It was education. It was the colonial equivalent of a support group. And women who attended quilting bees regularly reported feeling less exhausted, not more, even though they had worked all day. Modern psychology confirms this. Social connection reduces stress hormones. Sharing your burdens makes them lighter. Working alongside others with a shared purpose creates a sense of meaning that combats despair. Colonial women figured this out without any psychology textbooks. They just knew they felt better when they were together. But let me share something darker now, because we need to acknowledge it. Not all colonial women had access to these support systems. Enslaved women had no quilting bees. They had no choice about whether to rest when exhausted. Their exhaustion was compounded by trauma, by violence, by the horror of living in bondage. The remedies they developed, and they did develop them, preserving African medical knowledge, despite every attempt to strip them of their culture, were often inaccessible to them because their labour belonged to someone else. The sassafras tea that might have helped an enslaved woman cope with exhaustion, her owner might forbid it, fearing anything that gave slaves energy might lead to rebellion. The ginseng that grew in forests, she could not take time to gather it without permission. This is a crucial part of the story that often gets erased. When we talk about colonial medicine, we need to acknowledge that access was never equal. The remedies we are discussing helped free women who had some autonomy over their own time and bodies. Enslaved women, indentured servants, and the poorest labourers often could not access even these basic remedies. Now, let me tell you about one woman who documented her struggle with exhaustion so thoroughly that we can read her words today and recognise ourselves in them. Martha Ballard was a midwife in Maine. From 1785 until 1812 she kept a diary, not a polished memoir meant for publication but a daily record of her life. And that diary gives us an unfiltered look at female exhaustion in colonial America. Martha delivered over 1,000 babies in her career, but she was not just a midwife, she was also a wife, a mother, a gardener, a nurse, a textile producer. Her diary entries are exhausting just to read. One typical entry from July 1792. At Mr. Parker's, his wife delivered of a daughter at 1 o'clock this morning. I returned home at 7, baked bread, did laundry, prepared dinner, worked in the garden until evening, then was called to Mrs. Savage, who is in difficult labour, arrived at midnight. This woman worked 24 hours straight, then got up and did it again. How did she cope? Her diary tells us. She drank sage tea for strength. She took short naps whenever possible, even if only for 20 minutes. She relied on her daughters to help with household work when she was delivering babies. And she had a network of other women, midwives, neighbours, friends, who supported each other. But even Martha, as strong as she was, had moments of despair. In 1802 she wrote, "I am almost exhausted, my body fails me, I know not how long I can continue." She was 67 years old. She'd been working at this pace for decades, and she was simply worn out. Yet she continued for another 10 years. What kept her going? Partly duty, partly pride in her work, but also, I think, the knowledge that she was needed. That without her, women would give birth alone and terrified. That her exhaustion served a purpose. This is something I see repeated again and again in colonial women's writings. They acknowledged their exhaustion, they wished for rest, but they kept going because stopping was not an option. And here is what breaks my heart. They often blamed themselves for their exhaustion. They saw it as a personal failing, a lack of strength or faith rather than the natural result of impossible demands. One colonial woman's letter from 1760 says, "I am ashamed of my weakness. Other women manage their household with cheer and energy. I must be lacking in some essential virtue that I find myself so often spent and weary." Can you imagine? She was comparing herself to other women who were probably just as exhausted but hiding it better. She thought exhaustion was a moral failing. This mindset that women's exhaustion is somehow shameful, that we should be able to do everything without complaint, it started long before colonial America. But I think it was reinforced in this era because survival depended on relentless work. There was no room for weakness, so women learned to push through, to hide their exhaustion, to smile through the grinding fatigue, and that legacy, we are still living with it. But colonial women also left us a legacy of resilience. They figured out how to help each other. They learned which plants helped and which did not. They created social structures, quilting bees, barn raisings, communal bread baking, that provided support even when no formal institutions existed. They survived impossible circumstances with almost no resources, and in doing so they proved something important. Women are far stronger than anyone gives them credit for. But strength does not mean you're not tired. It means you keep going even when you are. As we move forward in history, we're about to enter an era that believed it had solved women's exhaustion. The Victorian age brought medicine, science, and new theories about women's health. Doctors finally started paying attention to female fatigue. But as we will see next, sometimes attention from doctors is not a blessing. Sometimes it is a curse because the Victorian medical establishment decided that exhausted women needed complete rest, total isolation, and absolute submission to male authority. They called it the rest cure, and it would become one of the most controversial, most damaging treatments in the history of women's health. Women would be confined to bed for months, forbidden to read or write, force-fed until they gained weight, treated like children who needed to be controlled. The exhausted pioneer women who pushed through would have been horrified, because at least they had agency, at least they had purpose. The rest cure would strip women of both in the name of healing them. The fight over how to treat women's exhaustion is about to become a fight over who controls women's bodies and women's lives, and that fight will define medicine for generations. She could afford everything. A beautiful home in Philadelphia, servants to do the heavy work, the finest foods, the best education, every material comfort that the colonial women we just met could only dream of. And yet Charlotte Perkins Gilman could not get out of bed. It was 1885, and something new was happening to women, something that baffled doctors and terrified families. Women who had never done manual labour, who had never hauled water or worked in fields, were collapsing from exhaustion, not occasionally, in epidemic numbers. They called it neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, and it was, according to Victorian doctors, the disease of modern civilization. Welcome to an era that believed progress itself was making women sick, where the rise of cities, the invention of the telegraph, the acceleration of life was supposedly draining women of something called nerve force, where rest became a prescription and isolation became treatment. This is the Victorian nerve force crisis, and it reveals something crucial about how society thinks about women's exhaustion. When you cannot see the labour, you assume there is none. Let me explain what I mean. Remember those colonial women? Their exhaustion made sense to everyone. You could see them carrying water, churning butter, working dawn to dusk. Of course they were tired, that was obvious. But Victorian middle-class women? They were not doing manual labour. They had servants. They wore corsets and long dresses and sat in parlours drinking tea. What did they have to be exhausted about? This question haunted Victorian medicine, and the answer they arrived at tells us more about their prejudices than about women's actual lives. The theory went like this. The modern world moves too fast. Telegrams bring news instantly. Trains rush through landscapes. Cities pulse with noise and crowds and constant stimulation. The human nervous system, which evolved for quiet rural life, cannot handle this pace. And women? Women's nervous systems were believed to be more delicate than men's, more refined, more sensitive, more easily overwhelmed. So women were supposedly the first to crack under the pressure of modern life. The physician who popularized this theory was an American neurologist named George Miller Beard. In 1869, he published a book called American Nervousness, and it became a sensation. Beard argued that every human being had a finite amount of nerve force. Imagine it like a battery that could be drained. When you overexerted yourself mentally or emotionally, you depleted your nerve force, and when it ran too low, you developed neurasthenia. The symptoms, they read like a catalogue of female complaints that doctors have been dismissing for centuries. Exhaustion, insomnia, headaches, digestive problems, inability to concentrate, anxiety, sadness, physical weakness despite no obvious disease. Sound familiar? Beard had essentially described what we would now recognize as burnout, depression, anxiety disorders, and chronic fatigue syndrome. But instead of looking at what might be causing these symptoms, he blamed modernity itself. And here is where it gets interesting. Because while Beard's theory was nonsense, his observations were accurate. Victorian women really were exhausted. The question is why? Let me take you inside a typical day for a Victorian middle-class woman, because the labour was invisible, but it was absolutely real. You wake early because even though you have servants, you must supervise them. You must plan meals, manage the household budget, ensure everything runs smoothly. This is not light work. You are essentially running a small business, but unpaid and unacknowledged. You must dress yourself, which in the Victorian era meant lacing a corset so tight you could barely breathe, then layering on pounds of fabric, chemise, petticoats, dress, possibly a bustle. Just getting dressed was exhausting. You must make social calls which were not leisure. They were work. Your husband's social standing, business prospects, and reputation depended on you maintaining proper relationships with the right families. You were networking, but it was disguised as tea parties. You must oversee your children's education, often teaching them yourself. You must do needlework because idle hands were sinful. You must organize charitable work because wealthy women were expected to help the poor. You must attend church, host dinners, write letters to maintain family connections. And underneath all of this, you must never, ever show anger, frustration, ambition, or any emotion deemed unfeminine. You must be cheerful, submissive, decorative, and pure. The emotional labor alone was crushing. Imagine spending every waking moment performing a role, never being allowed to be fully yourself. Imagine having intelligence and energy and ideas, but being told your only purpose was to be a beautiful object in your husband's home. Is it any wonder women were exhausted? But Victorian doctors could not see this, or would not, because acknowledging that women were exhausted from emotional and intellectual suppression would mean acknowledging that maybe society's treatment of women was the problem. So instead, they invented nerve force theory. They made it about women's delicate constitutions rather than about the cage women were trapped in. And the treatment? That brings us to one of the most controversial medical interventions in history, something we mentioned before, but now we will truly understand: the rest cure. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell developed the rest cure in the 1870s, and initially for Civil War soldiers suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. When he applied it to women with neurasthenia, it became wildly popular. Here is what the rest cure involved: 6 to 8 weeks of complete bed rest. You were not allowed to sit up. You were not allowed to read, write, sew, or do any intellectual work. You could not receive visitors except immediate family. You were force-fed a high-fat diet of milk, meat, and eggs until you gained substantial weight. You received daily massages and electrotherapy, having electrical currents run through your muscles to stimulate them because you were not allowed to exercise yourself. And most importantly, you had to submit completely to the male physician's authority. If you questioned the treatment, if you showed any resistance, that was proof your nerves were too weak and you needed more rest. Let that sink in for a moment. A woman suffering from exhaustion caused partly by lack of autonomy and creative outlet was prescribed complete passivity, total isolation, and absolute submission to male authority. Mitchell genuinely believed he was helping. He wrote that the rest cure made women, as a mother, more capable, as a wife, more helpful. He was trying to restore women to their proper domestic roles. But for many women, the rest cure was psychological torture. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who we met at the beginning of this section, underwent the rest cure with Mitchell himself. She later wrote that it nearly drove her insane. Mitchell's final instruction to her was, "Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you all the time. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day. And never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Never write, never create, never think too much. Just be a wife and a mother and nothing else." Gilman tried to follow these instructions. She lasted 3 months before she felt herself approaching complete mental breakdown. She wrote, "I made a rag baby, hung it on a doorknob and played with it. I crawled into closets and under beds crying helplessly." She was a brilliant writer and thinker, being told that thinking was making her sick. The cure was literally destroying her. So she did something radical. She left her husband. She defied Mitchell's orders. She started writing again, and she wrote a story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which became one of the most famous indictments of the rest cure ever published. In the story, a woman is confined to a room by her physician husband, forbidden from writing or working. Slowly, she descends into madness, seeing women trapped behind the yellow wallpaper of her room, creeping around trying to escape. The story is terrifying because it is barely fictionalized. That was what the rest cure did to women. It confirmed their worst fear, that they were weak, that they were hysterical, that they could not be trusted with their own minds. But here is the truly insidious part. Some women did feel better after the rest cure, not because it worked as Mitchell claimed, but because of what happened when they left. After weeks of complete rest and rich food, a woman who had been malnourished and exhausted would have more physical energy. After being isolated from her demanding family, she might have processed some of her stress. And most importantly, after being threatened with permanent invalidism, she might decide that enduring her exhausting life was preferable to being locked in a bedroom forever. The rest cure worked as a threat, as a warning, as a way to make women accept their circumstances rather than question them. Do you see the cruelty of it? Women who said, "I am exhausted and I cannot do this anymore," were told, "Then you must do absolutely nothing, including the things that give you joy and purpose." And when that made them worse, they were blamed for being too weak to handle the treatment. But not all women accepted this. Some, like Gilman, escaped and told their stories. Others found doctors who disagreed with Mitchell's approach. There were Victorian physicians who recognized that women needed not less activity but different activity, not isolation but community, not submission but agency. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the first female physicians in America, wrote a scathing critique of the rest cure in 1877. She argued that women's exhaustion came not from overuse of their brains, but from underuse. That boredom, lack of purpose, and intellectual starvation were making women sick. She prescribed the opposite of rest: education, work, physical exercise, intellectual engagement, and her patients improved. But Jacobi was swimming against the tide. The rest cure remained the standard treatment for neurasthenic women well into the 1920s. Thousands of women underwent it. Many were helped, not by the treatment itself, but by the rest and nutrition they desperately needed. Many others were traumatized, and the ones who were truly suffering? Women whose exhaustion came from real physical illness, anemia, thyroid disease, infections, hormonal imbalances. The rest cure did nothing for them, worse than nothing because it delayed actual treatment. I want you to imagine something. Imagine you are exhausted, truly depleted. You go to a doctor hoping for help, and he tells you that you must stop everything that makes your life meaningful. No work, no creativity, no intellectual stimulation. Just lie in bed and get fat and submit. How would that make you feel? Would it cure you? Or would it make you feel even more hopeless? The Victorian era gives us a crucial lesson about women's exhaustion. When society cannot or will not address the real causes of women's suffering, it will invent explanations that blame women themselves. Delicate nerves, weak constitutions, hysterical tendencies, anything except the truth, which is that a life without purpose, without autonomy, without the ability to use your full capacities is exhausting to the soul. But the story does not end with the rest cure. Because as we move into the 20th century, medicine is about to discover something that changes everything: chemistry. Coming up next, we are entering the age of tonics and patent medicines. We will explore the wild world of Victorian cure-alls, bottles of mysterious liquid that promise to restore nerve force, cure exhaustion, and make you feel like yourself again. Some contained helpful ingredients. Some contained alcohol, cocaine, and opium. And women bought them by the millions, desperate for anything that might help them survive their lives. The era of self-medication is about to begin, and it will reveal just how desperate women were for relief that the medical establishment refused to provide. The cure might have been worse than the disease, but what happens when the cure contains morphine? The bottle was small, elegantly shaped, with a label that promised everything. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children teething produces natural quiet sleep, relieves the child from pain. The mother must have rest. What the label did not say, each teaspoon contained 65 milligrams of morphine, and millions of mothers gave it to their babies. Not because they were careless, not because they were trying to harm their children, but because they were exhausted, desperate, and no one was telling them the truth. Welcome to the golden age of patent medicines, where the cure was often more dangerous than the disease, where addiction was marketed as health, and where exhausted women became the primary customers of an industry built on deception. This is the story of what happened when women could not get help from doctors, so they tried to heal themselves, and what the pharmaceutical companies did to exploit that desperation. Walk with me into a pharmacy in 1890. The shelves are lined with hundreds of bottles, each one promising miracles. Nerve tonics, female elixirs, restoratives, vigor boosters, blood purifiers. Their names alone tell a story. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, Vin Mariani, Coca-Cola. Yes, the same Coca-Cola you know today. Dr. Miles Naveen, Hostetta's stomach bitters, Warner's safe cure. Each one claiming to restore your energy, cure your exhaustion, make you feel alive again. And women bought them. Not occasionally, habitually. Some women took multiple tonics daily, mixing and matching, hoping something would work, because what else could they do? The rest cure was expensive and traumatic. Most doctors dismissed women's complaints. But a bottle of tonic? That cost 50 cents to $1. You could buy it without a prescription. You could take it in the privacy of your own home. It felt like taking control of your own health. It felt like agency. But here is what those women did not know. Most of these tonics contained alcohol, cocaine, morphine, or all three. Let me tell you about the most successful patent medicine of the Victorian era. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was created in 1875 by a woman named Lydia Estes Pinkham, a housewife in Massachusetts who genuinely wanted to help other women. She brewed the compound in her kitchen using herbs that traditional healers had used for generations. Black cohosh, life root, unicorn root, pleurisy root, and fenugreek. These were real medicinal plants. Some of them did have beneficial properties, particularly for menstrual issues. But Lydia also added one more ingredient: alcohol. The final product was 18% alcohol, about the same as wine. Lydia marketed her compound specifically to exhausted women. Her advertisement spoke directly to them. Are you tired, weak, unable to do your work, suffering from female complaints? She promised that her compound would restore health, energy, and vitality. And women loved it. Not just because it helped with menstrual cramps and hot flashes, though probably did help somewhat, but because when you are exhausted and you take something that is 18% alcohol, you feel better, at least temporarily. The alcohol gave women a boost. It helped them relax. It made their problems feel more manageable. And because it was labelled as medicine, not as alcohol, Women who would never dream of drinking wine could take Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound without shame. By the early 1900s, Lydia Pinkham's compound was one of the best-selling products in America. Women were buying it by the case, taking it daily. Some were taking it multiple times a day. Were they being treated for exhaustion? Or were they becoming alcoholics while thinking they were taking medicine? The answer is often both. And tragically, neither they nor their families understood what was happening. But alcohol was mild compared to what else was on the market. Let me tell you about Vin Mariani. This tonic was created in 1863 by a French chemist named Angelo Mariani. It was red wine infused with coca leaves, the same plant that cocaine comes from. Each glass contained about 6 milligrams of cocaine. Mariani marketed it as a cure for fatigue, depression, and neurasthenia. And it worked spectacularly because cocaine is a powerful stimulant. Women who took Vin Mariani felt energized, focused, euphoric. Their exhaustion vanished. They could work all day without tiring. They felt like themselves again, better than themselves. The drink became wildly popular. Pope Leo XIII endorsed it. Queen Victoria reportedly used it. Thomas Edison drank it. Sarah Bernhardt, the famous actress, credited it with sustaining her through exhausting performance schedules. And ordinary women, exhausted from running households and managing children and meeting society's impossible demands, drank it too. Some took it daily for years. Then came the crashes, the anxiety, the dependency, the realization that they could not function without it. And by the time they understood what was happening, they were addicted. But perhaps the most successful cocaine-based product was one that still exists today, though in very different form. In 1886, a pharmacist named John Pemberton created a nerve tonic he called Coca-Cola. The original formula contained coca leaf extract, cocaine, and cola nut, which contains caffeine. It was marketed as a cure for headaches, exhaustion, and nervous disorders. Pemberton's advertisements promised that Coca-Cola would cure your headache, relieve fatigue, and make you feel refreshed and invigorated. And it did all those things because it was essentially cocaine and caffeine in sugar water. Women bought it. They gave it to their children. They had no idea they were consuming a powerful stimulant drug. Cocaine was removed from Coca-Cola in 1903 after public awareness of cocaine's dangers finally grew. But for nearly 20 years, exhausted women had been self-medicating with cocaine, thinking it was simply a refreshing beverage. Now let me tell you about the opiates, because if the stimulants were problematic, the sedatives were catastrophic. Remember Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup that we started with? It was not an outlier. Dozens of products marketed to mothers contained morphine or opium, and they were used not just on babies, but by the mothers themselves. Dr. J. Collis Brown's chlorodyne contained morphine, chloroform, and cannabis. It was marketed as a cure for insomnia, anxiety, and exhaustion. Women took it nightly. Some took it multiple times a day. It made them sleep. It made their anxiety disappear. It made everything feel soft and manageable. It also made them addicts. By the late 1800s, doctors were beginning to recognize a pattern. They called it the Army of Women Invalids. These were women who had started taking patent medicines for legitimate exhaustion and had ended up bedridden, dependent on opiates, unable to function without them. But here is the cruelest irony. When these women sought help from physicians, they were often diagnosed with neurasthenia and prescribed the rest cure, the very treatment that had made many of them desperate enough to turn to patent medicines in the first place. It was a vicious cycle. Rest cure made women desperate. Patent medicines made them addicted. Addiction made them seek medical help. Medical help meant more rest cure. And through it all, the pharmaceutical companies kept advertising, kept promising, kept selling. Have you ever seen those vintage advertisements? They are beautiful in a disturbing way. Elegant women in flowing gowns, children with rosy cheeks, promises of health, vigor, and happiness. No mention of morphine, no mention of cocaine, just testimonials from satisfied customers and endorsements from doctors who were often paid for their recommendations. One advertisement for cocaine toothache drops marketed in the 1880s showed a cheerful family and promised instantaneous cure. It was marketed to children. The scale of this industry was enormous. By 1900, Americans were spending about $75 million annually on patent medicines. Adjusted for inflation, that would be over $2 billion today. And the primary consumers were women. Why? Because women's exhaustion was real, and no one was offering real solutions. Doctors dismissed them or subjected them to harmful treatments. Society blamed them for being weak, so they turned to bottles that promised easy relief. Can you blame them? I cannot. But the consequences were devastating. We will never know exactly how many women became addicted to patent medicines. The records are incomplete. Addiction was shameful, hidden, denied. Women who were dependent on laudanum or cocaine tonics were often written off as hysterics or invalids, their real problem never acknowledged. Some historians estimate that by the late 1800s, more women were addicted to opiates than men, not because women were weaker, but because women's pain and exhaustion were the primary targets of the patent medicine industry. The turning point came in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act. This law required that medicines containing alcohol, cocaine, morphine, or other dangerous substances had to list them on the label. The impact was immediate. When women saw that their soothing syrup contained morphine, many stopped buying it. When they realized their nerve tonic was 18% alcohol, they understood why they felt better after taking it, and why they felt worse when they ran out. Sales of many patent medicines plummeted. Some companies reformulated, some went out of business. Some, like Coca-Cola, removed the dangerous ingredients and survived as legitimate products. But the damage had been done. A generation of women had been turned into addicts by an industry that saw their exhaustion as a profit opportunity. And the saddest part? The herbs that were mixed in with the alcohol and opiates, some of them really did help. Black cohosh for menstrual issues, valerian for sleep, ginger for digestion. If women had been given access to these herbs without the addictive substances, if they had been taught how to use them safely, the story might have been different. But that would have required actually caring about women's health rather than profiting from women's desperation. I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. When we look back at Victorian women taking cocaine and morphine tonics, it is easy to judge, to think, how could they not know? How could they be so foolish? But remember, there were no labels, no ingredient lists, no FDA, no warnings, and these women were being told by doctors, by advertisements, by society, that these products were safe and beneficial. They were doing their best with the information they had. They were trying to survive impossible circumstances, and they were exploited. The patent medicine era teaches us something crucial. When legitimate medicine fails to address women's needs, when women's exhaustion is dismissed or punished rather than treated, women will find their own solutions. And those solutions will not always be safe, because desperation makes poor decisions seem reasonable. As we move forward, medicine is finally beginning to understand women's bodies better. The 20th century will bring real breakthroughs, hormones discovered, anemia treated with iron supplements, thyroid conditions diagnosed and managed. But it will also bring new challenges, because the next chapter in our story takes us to the midwifery wars, where male obstetricians fought to eliminate female midwives claiming superior knowledge and safety. We will see how the professionalization of childbirth often made it more dangerous, not less. And we will meet the women who fought back, who insisted that centuries of female knowledge about birth and postpartum recovery had value. The battle over who controls women's bodies, who has authority over a women's health, who gets to decide what women need, that battle is far from over, and the stakes keep getting higher. Because exhaustion is not just about being tired, it is about who has power, who has voice, who gets believed, And that fight continues. She lay in bed, forbidden to move. The room was dim, curtains drawn against the daylight. No books, no pen and paper, no visitors except the nurse who force-fed her milk and eggs 6 times a day. No stimulation, no thought, no purpose. Just endless suffocating stillness. This was supposed to heal her. This was what the most respected neurologist in America prescribed for exhausted women. 6 weeks of this, sometimes 8, sometimes longer if the patient did not improve, which, disturbingly often, she did not. We touched on the rest cure briefly before, but now we need to truly understand it. Because this treatment dominated how exhaustion was managed for nearly 50 years. And its legacy, the idea that women who are tired should be isolated, controlled, and stripped of agency, that legacy still haunts us. The rest cure was not just a medical treatment, it was a philosophy about women's nature, women's capabilities, and women's proper place in society. And it caused harm that we are still trying to undo. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell did not set out to torture women. In his mind, he was saving them. Let me explain his logic, because understanding why smart people do terrible things is important. Mitchell developed the rest cure during the American Civil War, treating soldiers with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. These men had seen horrors. They could not sleep. They jumped at sudden noises. They could not concentrate, and many of them were genuinely helped by a period of rest, good nutrition, and freedom from the battlefield. So when Mitchell returned to private practice and encountered exhausted women, wealthy women who could afford his expensive treatment, he applied the same logic. These women were nervous, tired, unable to function. Clearly they needed rest, peace, removal from the stresses of their lives. But here is where his reasoning went catastrophically wrong. Mitchell believed that women's exhaustion came from overusing their brains and reproductive systems simultaneously. He wrote that women had a finite amount of energy, and if they spent it on intellectual pursuits, they would have nothing left for their wombs. Yes, really. He believed thinking too much made women infertile and exhausted. So his treatment was designed not just to rest the body, but to shut down the mind entirely. To make women stop thinking, stop creating, stop being anything except passive recipients of care. The typical rest cure protocol was brutal in its thoroughness. First, complete bed rest. The patient was not allowed to sit up, let alone walk. Some physicians even forbade women from rolling over in bed without assistance. Second, isolation. No visitors except immediate family, and even they were limited. No stimulation, no entertainment. Some doctors even forbade women from feeding themselves, insisting the nurse do it, because using a fork was too much exertion. Third, overfeeding. The patient was given massive amounts of milk, cream, eggs, and meat. The goal was to gain substantial weight, 20 to 50 pounds over 6 to 8 weeks. Mitchell believed that fat women were healthier, more fertile, more docile. Fourth, passive exercise. Since the patient could not move, nurses would massage her limbs and apply electrical currents to her muscles. This was supposed to maintain muscle tone. In reality, it often caused pain and did little to prevent the muscle atrophy that comes from prolonged bed rest. Fifth, and most insidiously, intellectual deprivation. No reading, no writing, no sewing or knitting, no music, no conversation beyond pleasantries. The mind was to be kept as blank and passive as possible. And sixth, absolute obedience to the male physician. Any resistance, any questioning, any expression of frustration or despair was seen as proof that the nerves were still too excitable and the treatment needed to be extended. Now imagine you are an exhausted woman in 1890. You're tired, yes, but you're also bored, understimulated, frustrated by the limitation society places on you. You have energy and intelligence and ambition, but nowhere to direct them. You go to Dr. Mitchell hoping for help, and he prescribes 6 weeks of lying motionless in a dark room, being forbidden from thinking. How is that going to make you feel? For some women, it was a complete breakdown. Virginia Woolf, the brilliant writer, underwent a modified rest cure and later described it as one of the most traumatic experiences of her life. She wrote about the horror of lying in bed, feeling her mind trying to work, to create, to process, and being forbidden from doing so. The mental anguish was worse than the physical exhaustion had ever been. But here is what makes this especially infuriating. Some women did report feeling better after the rest cure, and Mitchell used these success stories to justify continuing the treatment for decades. So what was actually happening? Why did some women improve? First, many exhausted Victorian women were genuinely malnourished. They were laced into corsets so tight they could not eat properly. They were expected to have tiny waists, so they ate very little. The forced feeding, while humiliating, did address real nutritional deficiencies. Second, some women were anemic from repeated pregnancies and blood loss. The high-meat diet provided iron. Not the most pleasant way to get iron, but effective. Third, and this is crucial, the rest cure removed women from their exhausting circumstances. For 6 weeks, they did not have to manage households, entertain guests, meet social obligations, or endure unwanted sexual relations with their husbands. They got a break. Fourth, the attention they received, even if it was controlling and infantilizing, was still attention. For women who felt invisible and unimportant, having a famous doctor focus on their care felt validating. But here is the tragedy. All of these benefits could have been achieved without the isolation, the intellectual deprivation, or the forced passivity. A woman could be well fed, rested, and temporarily relieved of her duties without being treated like a prisoner. Mitchell just could not imagine giving women rest without also controlling them completely. And when women did not improve, when the isolation made their depression worse, when the forced inactivity made their bodies weaker, when the intellectual starvation made their minds scream for stimulation, Mitchell blamed them. He said their nerves were too damaged, their constitutions too delicate. He never questioned whether the treatment itself might be harmful. Let me share a specific case that shows how devastating this could be. In 1902, a woman named Zelda Fitzgerald, yes, the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, though this was before she married him, was prescribed the rest cure for exhaustion and nervous symptoms. She was 19 years old, brilliant, creative, full of life. The rest cure required her to lie still for 8 weeks. No dancing, which she loved, no socializing, no writing, no creative expression of any kind. When she emerged, she was not healed. She was broken. She later said that those 8 weeks taught her that her desires, her energy, her creativity were all symptoms of illness, that who she naturally was, vibrant and ambitious, was wrong and needed to be suppressed. The rest cure did not cure her exhaustion, it taught her to be ashamed of herself. Zelda would struggle with mental health for her entire life, and while we cannot blame the rest cure for all of it, we can recognize that telling a creative, energetic young woman that everything about her was pathological did immeasurable harm. Now let me tell you about the women who fought back, because not everyone submitted quietly. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who we met earlier, wrote the yellow wallpaper specifically to expose the horrors of the rest cure. She sent a copy to Mitchell himself, hoping to make him understand what he was doing to women. Mitchell's response: he claimed the story was too morbid and disturbing and that Gilman was clearly still mentally unwell. He never acknowledged that his treatment might be the problem. But Gilman's story spread. It was read by thousands of women who recognized themselves in it. And some doctors began to question whether the rest cure was truly therapeutic or simply a way to control difficult women. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, one of the first female physicians in America, published a scathing critique in 1891. She presented evidence that forced inactivity was actually harmful, that muscles atrophied, that minds deteriorated, that women who were kept passive became more depressed, not less. She argued for the opposite approach: physical activity, intellectual engagement, meaningful work, and her patients improved. But Jacobi was fighting against the full weight of the medical establishment. Mitchell was famous, respected, and male. She was a woman in a profession that barely tolerated female practitioners. Her critique was noted but largely ignored. The rest cure continued well into the 1920s. Thousands of women underwent it, and we will never fully know how many were harmed, how many had their spirits crushed, how many lost years of their lives to lying in dark rooms being told that thinking was dangerous. But here is something we need to acknowledge. The rest cure reveals a fundamental truth about how exhaustion was understood, or rather misunderstood. Victorian doctors saw exhausted women and assumed the problem was that women were doing too much, but they never asked what women were actually doing. They never questioned whether the real problem was that women were allowed to do too little of what mattered. A woman who was exhausted from intellectual starvation, from lack of purpose, from being treated as a decorative object, was prescribed more starvation, more passivity, more objectification. It's like treating someone who is dying of thirst by taking away their water. The logic is perfectly backwards, and yet it persisted for decades because it fit what society wanted to believe, that women were naturally weak, naturally prone to nervous exhaustion, naturally in need of male control and guidance. The rest cure was not really about healing women, it was about keeping them in their place. Now, you might be wondering, when did this finally end? What made the medical establishment realize this treatment was harmful? The answer is partly time, partly new science, partly women's own resistance. As the 20th century progressed, new treatments emerged. The discovery of vitamins meant that nutritional deficiencies could be addressed directly. The development of psychology meant that depression could be understood as something other than weak nerves. And the women's movement of the 1920s meant that more women had voices, had options, had the power to say no. But the legacy remains. Even today, when women report chronic exhaustion, they are often told to rest more, to do less, to lower their expectations. The assumption that women's exhaustion means they are doing too much rather than not enough of what matters still lurks in medical thinking. How many women today are told they just need to relax, to take it easy, to stop being so ambitious or stressed? How many are prescribed rest when what they actually need is purpose, agency, and validation? The ghost of the rest cure still haunts us, but we are learning to exorcise it. As we move toward the end of our journey, we are about to enter the modern era. We are going to see how 20th century medicine finally began to understand what actually causes women's fatigue, anemia, thyroid disorders, hormonal imbalances, autoimmune conditions, real treatable physical problems. But we are also going to see how that scientific progress came with a cost. Because as medicine became more focused on finding physical causes, it sometimes dismissed the very real exhaustion that comes from emotional labor, from systemic oppression, from living in a world that demands everything from women and offers little support. The final chapters of our story will show us what we have learned, what we have forgotten, and what we are still fighting to change. The journey from wandering wombs to modern medicine has been long and painful, but it is also a story of resilience, resistance, and hope. Because women have always been exhausted, but women have never stopped fighting for the right to be heard, believed, and properly cared for. And that fight continues today. A simple blood test, that is all it took. In 1923, a doctor in Boston drew blood from a patient who had been exhausted for years. He looked at the sample under a microscope and saw something that previous doctors had missed. Her red blood cells were pale and misshapen. She was severely anemic. He prescribed iron supplements. Within 6 weeks, she felt like a different person. The exhaustion that had defined her life for over a decade simply disappeared. This is the story we have been waiting for, the moment when medicine finally started getting it right, when exhaustion stopped being blamed on wandering wombs or delicate nerves or moral weakness, and started being recognized as something that could be measured, diagnosed, and actually treated. But getting here took longer than it should have, and the journey was paved with more false promises, more dangerous treatments, and more women suffering needlessly. Welcome to the early 20th century, where science was finally catching up to what women had been saying all along. I am not hysterical. I am not weak. Something is actually wrong and I need real help. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. World War I. During the war, military doctors noticed that soldiers who were exhausted and weak often had low red blood cell counts. They discovered that supplementing with iron-rich foods or iron tonics helped these soldiers recover quickly. After the war, some forward-thinking physicians started testing civilian women for anemia, and what they found was shocking. A huge percentage of exhausted women were anemic, not because they were constitutionally weak, but because they were losing blood through menstruation and childbirth without adequate nutritional replacement. It was that simple and that fixable. But here is the tragedy. This knowledge existed much earlier. Medieval wise women knew that iron-rich foods helped exhausted women. The Trotula, written in 11th century Salerno, recommended liver and red meat for women weakened by blood loss. Colonial midwives prescribed nettle tea, which is high in iron. Women had known this for centuries, but it took male military doctors treating male soldiers for the medical establishment to take it seriously. Still, progress was progress. By the 1920s and 30s, testing for anemia became more common. Iron supplements became available without the alcohol and cocaine that previous tonics contained, and thousands of women finally got the help they needed. But anemia was just one piece of the puzzle. Because as doctors started actually testing exhausted women, instead of just theorizing about them, they discovered something else. Many exhausted women had thyroid problems. The thyroid is a small gland in your neck that regulates metabolism, energy production, and dozens of other crucial functions. When it is underactive, you feel exhausted no matter how much you rest. You gain weight easily, you feel cold all the time, your mind feels foggy. Sound familiar? These symptoms had been dismissed as neurasthenia for decades, but they were actually hypothyroidism, a completely treatable condition. In 1915, Dr. Edward Calvin Kendall isolated thyroxine, the hormone produced by the thyroid gland. By the 1920s, thyroid extract from animal glands could be given as medication, and women who'd been exhausted for years, who had undergone rest cures and been prescribed nerve tonics and been told they were simply too delicate for modern life, suddenly had energy again. One doctor in Philadelphia kept records of his hyperthyroid patients. Of the 87 women he treated between 1925 and 1930, 73 reported significant improvement within 3 months of starting thyroid medication. 73 out of 87. That is an 84% success rate. Compare that to the rest cure, which had no proven success rate and often made women worse. But getting diagnosed was still a battle. Many doctors clung to the old theories. They believed that women were naturally prone to exhaustion and that testing for physical causes was unnecessary. Some openly mocked the idea that a simple gland malfunction could cause the complex symptoms exhausted women described. Let me tell you about one woman who fought for her diagnosis. Her name was Mary and she lived in Chicago in 1928. For 5 years she had been profoundly exhausted. She had seen multiple doctors. All of them told her she was neurasthenic. One prescribed the rest cure, another prescribed a nerve tonic that made her feel worse. A third suggested she was simply not suited for the demands of being a wife and mother. Then she read an article in a women's magazine about thyroid deficiency. The symptoms matched hers exactly. She brought the article to her doctor and asked to be tested. He refused. He said that magazine articles were not medical science and that she should not diagnose herself. She went to another doctor. Same response. Finally, she found a young physician fresh out of medical school who had learned about thyroid testing in his training. He ran the test. She was severely hypothyroid. She started medication. Within weeks, the fog lifted. The exhaustion eased. She could think clearly again. She could take care of her children without feeling like she was drowning. She wrote a letter to the magazine that had published the article. She said, "I fought for 5 years to be believed. I was told I was weak, hysterical, unsuited for motherhood. All I needed was a simple medication. How many other women are suffering needlessly because doctors will not listen? How many indeed? We will never know how many women in the 1920s and 30s were hyperthyroid but went undiagnosed. How many spent years exhausted because their doctors preferred theories about delicate nerves to actual blood tests. But slowly testing became more common, and as it did, more physical causes of exhaustion were discovered. Diabetes. Before insulin was discovered in 1921, diabetes was a death sentence. But even after insulin became available, many diabetic women went undiagnosed for years because their fatigue was attributed to nerves rather than blood sugar. Vitamin deficiencies. The discovery of vitamins in the early 20th century revolutionized nutrition. Vitamin B12 deficiency causes profound exhaustion. So does vitamin D deficiency. Before these vitamins were identified, women suffering from deficiencies were called neurasthenic. Chronic infections. Tuberculosis causes exhaustion long before the cough and fever appear. So does chronic urinary tract infection, endocarditis, and many other infections. Blood tests and cultures could detect these, but only if doctors thought to look. Autoimmune conditions. This is where it gets really interesting because we are still learning about these. Conditions like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and multiple sclerosis often present first with fatigue. Women would say, "I am so tired and everything hurts," and for decades they were dismissed as hysterics. But in the mid-20th century, researchers discovered that these were real, measurable conditions where the body attacks itself, and they were far more common in women than in men. Why? We still do not fully understand, but the point is, women were not imagining their exhaustion. They had real physical conditions that medicine was only just beginning to understand. Here is what strikes me most about this period. As soon as doctors started actually testing women instead of theorizing about them, they found problems, physical, measurable, treatable problems, which raises an uncomfortable question. How much of the previous centuries of female exhaustion could have been diagnosed and treated if doctors had simply listened and tested? How many women underwent the rest cure when they just needed iron? How many were called hysterical when they were hypothyroid? How many died from untreated infections or diabetes because their fatigue was dismissed as weakness? The answer is, we will never know, but the number is certainly in the thousands, probably in the tens of thousands, possibly more. And yet, even as medicine made these incredible advances, even as physical causes were found and treated, something important was lost. Because not all exhaustion is physical. Some exhaustion is real and valid even when the blood tests come back normal. The exhaustion of caring for others with no support. The exhaustion of living in a society that demands you be perfect while giving you no resources. The exhaustion of emotional labor, of always managing other people's feelings, of never being allowed to rest. This kind of exhaustion does not show up on a blood test, but it is just as real. And as medicine became more focused on finding physical causes, it sometimes dismissed the women whose exhaustion was psychological, social, or circumstantial. These women were told, "Your tests are normal, so nothing is wrong. Go home, you're fine." But they were not fine. They were drowning. They just had a kind of exhaustion that medical science had not yet learned to measure or validate. This tension between exhaustion that has a clear physical cause and exhaustion that does not, this is still with us today. And we are still figuring out how to address both kinds with compassion and effectiveness. Let me share something personal for a moment. When I researched this history, when I read about women fighting for diagnoses, fighting to be believed, fighting to prove that their exhaustion was real, I felt something shift in me. Because I have been that woman. You probably have too. The woman who knows something is wrong but cannot prove it, who feels dismissed by doctors who look at normal test results and conclude you are fine when you absolutely are not. The history we have explored tonight is not just about the past. It is about every woman who has ever been too tired and not known why. Every woman who has been told it is all in her head. Every woman who has fought to be heard, to be believed, to be taken seriously. And here is what I want you to understand. The fight is not over. We have come so far. We can test for anemia and thyroid problems and vitamin deficiencies. We have treatments that actually work. Women are no longer prescribed rest cures or cocaine tonics or forced isolation, but women are still exhausted, still fighting to be believed, still navigating a medical system that sometimes listens and sometimes does not. Which brings us to the final chapter of our journey. We have travelled from ancient Greece to modern medicine. We have seen progress and setbacks, breakthroughs and disasters. We have met women who healed and women who were harmed, women who resisted and women who endured. And now we need to ask, what have we learned? What has changed? What still needs to change? In our final part, we're going to bring this all together. We will look at modern exhaustion, at chronic fatigue syndrome, at burnout culture, at the million ways women are still depleted in today's world. We will see what ancient wisdom still applies and what needs to be left behind. And we will talk about what comes next. Because this story does not end with a cure, it ends with a choice. The choice to honour women's experiences, to believe women when they say they are tired, and to build a world where exhaustion is not the price women pay for existing. The journey is almost complete, but the most important part is still ahead. We have travelled so far together tonight, from ancient Athens where exhaustion was blamed on wandering wombs, through medieval monasteries where nuns preserved healing knowledge, past witch trials that destroyed generations of female healers, through the Victorian nightmare of rest cures and nerve tonics, and finally to the 20th century where science just began to get it right. But our story does not end in the past because women are still exhausted, still fighting to be believed, still searching for answers that sometimes come easily and sometimes remain frustratingly out of reach. So let me bring this full circle. Let me show you what we have learned, what we have forgotten, and what still needs to change. In 1984, something extraordinary happened. The Centers for Disease Control in the United States officially recognized a condition called chronic fatigue syndrome. For the first time in modern history, the medical establishment acknowledged that some people, disproportionately women, experience profound, debilitating exhaustion that cannot be explained by standard tests. This was revolutionary. For centuries, exhaustion without an obvious physical cause had been dismissed as hysteria, neurasthenia, or weakness. Now it had a name, now it was real. But here is where it gets complicated, because even with official recognition, chronic fatigue syndrome patients, about 70 to 85% of whom are women, still face the same dismissals that exhausted women have faced for millennia. Doctors who do not believe it is real, family members who think they are exaggerating, society that assumes they are just lazy or seeking attention. Some things, it seems, have not changed as much as we might hope, yet other things have changed dramatically. We now understand that women's exhaustion can come from dozens of identifiable causes: iron deficiency anemia, hypothyroidism, vitamin deficiencies, autoimmune conditions, sleep disorders, hormonal imbalances, chronic infections, depression, anxiety disorders. We have tests for most of these. We have treatments that work. A woman who is exhausted today has options that her great-grandmother could never have imagined. But we have also learned something crucial that brings us back to where we started. Sometimes the remedies that ancient healers used actually worked. Remember the herbs we talked about in the beginning? Valerian for sleep, chamomile for anxiety, ginger for nausea and inflammation, black cohosh for hormonal balance. These were not superstitions. Modern pharmacology has validated their effectiveness. The medieval nuns who prescribed sage for mental clarity, they were right. Sage contains compounds that support cognitive function. The colonial women who drank nettle tea for exhaustion, they were treating iron deficiency and it helped. The wise women who recommended rest in community, support from other women, meaningful work, time in nature, they understood something that modern medicine is only now rediscovering, that healing requires more than just fixing what is broken in the body. We are finally coming full circle. Integrative medicine now combines the best of modern science with traditional remedies. Doctors prescribe iron supplements but also recommend adaptogenic herbs. They treat thyroid disorders but also address stress, sleep, and lifestyle. This is what those wise women were doing all along. They just did it without lab coats and medical degrees. But there is one form of exhaustion that still challenges us, and I want to talk about it directly because it affects so many women right now. Burnout. The exhaustion that comes not from a gland malfunction or vitamin deficiency, but from living in a world that demands everything from women and offers inadequate support. The exhaustion of working full-time while also being the primary caregiver. The exhaustion of managing a household, coordinating everyone's schedules, remembering all the details. The exhaustion of emotional labor, always managing other people's feelings, always being the one who smooths things over, always putting others first. This exhaustion does not show up on blood tests. You can have perfect iron levels, perfect thyroid function, and still be completely depleted. And here is what modern medicine is slowly learning. This kind of exhaustion is just as real and just as harmful as exhaustion from anemia or hypothyroidism. The stress hormones it produces damage the body. The chronic activation of the stress response wears down the immune system. The lack of restoration leads to inflammation, heart disease, cognitive decline. Burnout is not in your head, it is in your body. It is measurable, it is real, and it cannot be fixed by an iron supplement or thyroid pill. It requires something harder, changing the circumstances that cause it. This is where we need to acknowledge something uncomfortable. For all of medicine's advances, for all the tests and treatments we now have, women are arguably more exhausted than ever. Why? Because the demands have only increased. Women are expected to work like they do not have families and parent like they do not have jobs. They are supposed to be successful professionals, perfect mothers, attentive wives, fit and attractive, socially engaged, and always pleasant. No wonder women are tired. The ancient Greek woman who was exhausted had heavy physical labor, but lower expectations. The Victorian woman had impossible social demands but servants to help with daily tasks. The colonial woman had crushing work but community support and clear purpose. Modern women have all of the demands and often very little of the support. So what is the answer? What have we learned from this long journey through history? First, believe women. When a woman says she is exhausted, she is telling you the truth. It might be anemia. It might be thyroid disease, it might be burnout from impossible circumstances, but it is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Second, test for the physical causes, but do not stop there. Run the blood work, check the thyroid, look for vitamin deficiencies. But if those tests come back normal and the woman is still exhausted, that does not mean nothing is wrong. It means you need to look deeper. Third, remember that healing is not just medical. Those wise women and medieval nuns and colonial quilting bees understood something crucial. Humans need community, need purpose, need rest, need support, need to feel that their labor matters. You cannot cure burnout with medication. You need structural change. You need a partner who shares the load equally. You need affordable childcare. You need workplaces that do not demand your soul. You need time to rest without guilt. Fourth, some ancient remedies really do work. Not instead of modern medicine, but alongside it. There is nothing wrong with drinking chamomile tea for anxiety while also seeing a therapist. Nothing wrong with taking adaptogenic herbs while managing your stress through meditation or exercise. The best approach is usually both. Science and tradition, testing and listening, medicine and wisdom. Fifth, and this is perhaps most important, stop blaming exhausted women for their exhaustion. For centuries, women were told their fatigue was their own fault. They were too weak, too hysterical, too delicate, not trying hard enough. We know better now, or we should. Exhaustion is often a rational response to irrational demands. It is your body saying this is too much. And the answer is not to force yourself to do more. The answer is to change what is being demanded of you. Let me share one final story that brings all of this together. In 2019, just before the pandemic changed everything, a woman I know, let me call her Sarah, went to her doctor completely depleted. She was working full-time, raising 2 young children, caring for an aging parent. She could barely get through the day. Her doctor ran tests. Everything came back normal. And instead of dismissing her, instead of saying, "You're fine, go home," the doctor said something remarkable. She said, "Your body is fine, your life is not. You are not sick. You're exhausted from doing the work of 3 people. That is not a medical problem. That is a structural problem." Then she wrote Sarah a prescription, not for medication, but for resources. Contact information for affordable childcare, a list of support groups, a referral to a therapist who specialized in women's burnout. And this note, you deserve support. What you are doing is unsustainable, and it is not your job to sustain the unsustainable. Sarah cried in that office, because for the first time a doctor had validated what she knew but had been afraid to say. She could not do this alone, and she should not have to. That doctor understood what Hildegard of Bingen understood in the 12th century, what Trota of Salerno understood in the 11th century, what the wise women and midwives and healers understood across centuries, that women's exhaustion is rarely just about the body. It is about the whole person, the whole life, the whole impossible situation. And the cure is not just medicine. It is justice. It is support. It is a world that values women's labour enough to make it sustainable. We are not there yet. We are making progress. Better diagnoses, better treatments, better understanding. But we still have far to go. Women are still exhausted, still fighting to be believed, still doing the work of multiple people and being told they should be grateful for the opportunity. But here is what I want you to take from this long journey we have shared tonight. You are not crazy, you are not weak, you are not imagining it. If you are exhausted, there is a reason. Maybe it is physical and can be tested and treated. Maybe it is circumstantial and requires changing your situation. Maybe it is both. But it is real, and you deserve help. You deserve to be believed. You deserve a life that does not leave you constantly depleted. The women we have met tonight, from Agnodis, who disguised herself as a man to practice medicine, to Hildegard, who combined mysticism with medical knowledge, to the wise women who were killed for healing, to Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who escaped the rest cure and told the truth, to the countless unnamed women who survived impossible circumstances with herbs and hope in each other. All of them fought for the right to be heard, to be helped, to be treated as if their suffering mattered. And that fight continues in every woman who insists on a second opinion, in every woman who refuses to accept it is all in your head, in every woman who supports another woman, who shares what worked for her, who says, "I believe you." The story of women's exhaustion is not over, it is ongoing, and you are part of it. So thank you. Thank you for listening to this long history. Thank you for sitting with the darkness of witch trials and rest cures and patent medicine addiction. Thank you for celebrating the small victories, the blood test that finally revealed anemia, the thyroid treatments that restored energy, the doctors who listened. And thank you for being here, for being part of the generation that might finally change how we treat exhausted women. Because every time you believe yourself when you say you are tired, every time you insist on being taken seriously, every time you rest without guilt or support another woman, or refuse to accept inadequate care, you are continuing the work that Agnodis started 2,400 years ago. The work of insisting that women's bodies, women's pain, women's exhaustion matters. That work is not finished, but we are further along than we have ever been, and that is worth acknowledging, worth celebrating, worth continuing. Rest well tonight, knowing that you are part of a long line of women who refused to be silenced, who insisted on being heard, who survived and helped each other survive. And when you wake, if you're still tired, know this: you are not alone, you're not broken, you're human, you're doing your best, and you deserve support. The story continues, and I will be here to tell more of it. Until next time, take care of yourself, you deserve it. Good night.